Alexander Whitmore slid the divorce papers across the table at their 5th anniversary party in front of 400 guests and told his wife she was a chapter of his past, not his future. He didn't whisper it. He said it loud enough for the entire ballroom to hear. Then he handed her a check for $200,000, like she was the employee being let go. He had no idea he had just declared war on one of the most powerful women alive. If you are new here, please subscribe and hit the notification bell so you never miss a story like this. Drop the name of your city in the comments right now. I want to see how far this story travels. Now let's get into it. The Beverly Crown Hotel had seen a lot of things in its 60-year history. Hollywood divorces, political scandals, business empires launched over handshakes in its marble lobbies. It had absorbed the secrets of the powerful and said nothing the way old buildings do when they understand their value comes from silence. But not even the Beverly Crown had seen anything like the night of May the 14th. The ballroom on the 3rd floor had been rented for the occasion at a cost most people would never spend on a house. Crystal chandeliers, white roses imported from Holland, a 12-piece orchestra playing Sinatra, softly enough that you could still hear the champagne glasses clinking. The guest list read like a who's who of Los Angeles: money tech founders, real estate titans, hedge fund managers, a senator, 2 Hollywood producers, and more lawyers than anyone could count. 417 people dressed in their finest gathered to celebrate the 5th wedding anniversary of Alexander Whitmore and his wife Claire. Alexander stood near the entrance greeting his guests with the kind of handshake that said, "I know exactly how important I am." He was 41 years old and looked exactly like the magazine profiles described him. Square jaw, tailored charcoal suit, dark eyes that had learned to calculate everything they looked at. He had the smile of a man who had never lost anything he went after. A smile so practiced it no longer reached his eyes, but still managed to fool most rooms. His guests loved him. They always did. He had a way of making every person feel like the most important one in the room. A skill he had learned early and sharpened deliberately because Alexander Whitmore understood that power was not just about money. It was about making people feel they needed you around. Claire stood near the back of the room. She was not hiding. That was simply where she preferred to be. She wore a deep blue evening gown, understated and elegant, the kind of dress that didn't demand attention but rewarded anyone who looked carefully enough. Her dark hair was pulled up simply. She held a glass of sparkling water, not champagne, and she spoke quietly with a few guests near the dessert table, the kind of people Alexander rarely made time for. An elderly professor, a woman who ran a children's literacy program, a retired schoolteacher from Pasadena. Claire had always been more comfortable in those conversations. She was 38 years old, and she was beautiful in a way that was easy to overlook if you were too busy looking at everything else. She didn't perform her beauty. She didn't announce her intelligence. She simply existed in a room with a kind of quiet certainty that some people found magnetic and others found puzzling because they couldn't figure out what she was so confident about. Most of Alexander's guests considered her pleasant and unremarkable. That was exactly the way she had designed it. Marcus Webb, Alexander's chief business partner, was watching Claire from across the room with the particular nervousness of a man who knows something is about to happen and cannot decide whether to stop it. Marcus was 53, heavyset, with the ruddy complexion of someone who had spent too many years working too hard and eating too fast. He and Alexander had built Whitmore Global together from the ground floor back when they were both young and hungry, and the company fit in a single rented office in downtown Los Angeles. Marcus understood Alexander better than most people. He understood what tonight was. He took out his phone and typed a message, then deleted it, then typed it again. He did not send it. At the far end of the room near the bar stood Victoria Lane. She was 32, with the kind of sharp, aggressive attractiveness that comes with absolute self-assurance. She worked as Alexander's executive assistant, a title that had long since become insufficient for what she actually was to him. She stood watching the room the way people watch something they believe they are about to own. Her dress was red. She had specifically chosen red. The orchestra shifted from Sinatra to something slower. A few couples moved to the floor. It was 8:43 in the evening. At 8:45, Alexander excused himself from a conversation with a senator and walked toward the private room off the main hallway. He was gone for 6 minutes. When he returned, he was carrying a manila folder. Nobody paid particular attention. Alexander was always carrying something. documents, contracts, proposals. The man never stopped working, even at parties. It was one of the things people said about him, with a mixture of admiration and exhaustion. He walked directly to Claire. She saw him coming. She turned toward him with a small, neutral smile, the way you turn toward someone you have been married to for 5 years and know every expression of, including the ones they try to hide. She noticed the folder immediately. She noticed how he was holding it, not casually but deliberately, like a weapon he was deciding whether to draw. "Alexander," she said quietly. He didn't say her name back. He placed the folder on the table beside the anniversary cake. The cake was 5 tiers white frosting, with their initials pressed in gold at the top. "Sign it tonight," he said. The 2 words dropped into the conversation like stones into still water. Claire looked down at the folder. She looked up at him. She said nothing yet, because she was a woman who had always believed in giving people one more second to reconsider. He didn't reconsider. "It's already drawn up. The lawyers have been over everything. I've been more than fair." Marcus across the room finally saw what was happening. He started moving through the crowd, too slowly. The orchestra was still playing. The guests nearest to them, 3 couples, a small cluster of investors, had gone very quiet, in the way people go quiet when they realize they are witnessing something private that is no longer private. "Alexander," Claire said, and now her voice was careful, measured, not because she was frightened, because she was deciding how much to show. "This is our anniversary dinner." "I know what it is," he said, "and I know this isn't ideal timing, but I also know you, Claire. If I had done this quietly in a lawyer's office, you would have found a way to delay it, to complicate it. I need this done." "You need this done," she repeated. "Yes. Tonight. Yes." The nearest clusters of guests had stopped pretending not to hear. The circle of silence was spreading outward from where they stood, quiet, rippling out like those stones in water, and now 12 people, 24 were watching without quite understanding yet what they were seeing. Victoria Lane set down her drink. She was watching Alexander with the particular attention of someone waiting for a performance they had rehearsed from a distance. Claire opened the folder. Inside was a divorce settlement agreement, 17 pages, professional, thorough, and clipped to the front page was a check. She looked at the amount. $200,000 for 5 years of marriage, for 5 years of running his household quietly and efficiently while he built his empire, for 5 years of attending events and sitting through dinner parties and listening to his business problems and offering the kind of calm, clear-headed perspective that had saved him from at least 3 catastrophic decisions she could count from memory. For 5 years of being the person he came home to, the person who kept the private Alexander from completely disappearing inside the public one. $200,000. Her face did not change, and that somehow was the most unsettling thing anyone in that room had ever seen. "You were never meant for this world," Alexander said. He said it quietly, but the room was so silent now that it carried. "You were a chapter of my past, Claire, not my future." Somewhere behind her, she heard a woman gasp softly. Someone else cleared their throat. A server near the far wall had stopped moving entirely, holding a tray of champagne flutes, and clearly wishing he was anywhere else on the planet. Alexander was still talking. "I've given you a generous settlement, more than what our prenuptial required. I think that shows I have no ill will toward you. You're a good person. I've changed. My life has changed, and I need to be honest about that." How was good? Even in this moment, he was managing the room, framing himself as someone being painfully but necessarily honest, someone doing the hard thing for the right reasons, the billionaire who was being generous, who had no ill will. Claire looked at him for a long moment. Then she picked up the pen, not in a hurry, not with trembling hands. She picked it up the way a woman picks up a pen when she has already made her decision, and the only remaining question is how clearly she wants to write her name. She signed, slowly and clearly. And then she capped the pen, set it precisely on top of the folder, and looked up at Alexander with an expression he did not recognize. He had expected relief, maybe, or hurt, or anger, which he knew how to manage. He had braced himself for a scene, had even prepared words for it. He had not prepared for this. Her eyes were completely steady, and in them was something he couldn't name, not contempt, not grief, not satisfaction. Something quieter and more final than any of those things. "Thank you," she said. That was all. She picked up her glass of sparkling water, turned away from him, and walked calmly through the now completely silent ballroom toward the exit. The orchestra had stopped playing. The players were watching with the confused and slightly horrified expressions of people who have no idea whether to keep performing or pack up their instruments. Alexander stood holding the signed folder. Around him, 417 people were staring. Victoria Lane was moving toward him with that red dress and that particular smile, and Alexander forced himself to smile back, because whatever else he was a man who controlled every room he entered. But something was wrong. He could feel it and he couldn't explain it. He had won. The papers were signed. The marriage was over. He had done what he needed to do. So why did it feel like something had just begun? Claire sat in the back of a black car moving through the Los Angeles streets, and she did not cry. She had given herself permission to cry earlier in the weeks since she had known what Alexander was planning. She had sat in the back of her bookstore after closing among the shelves of first editions and forgotten novels, and she had cried quietly and completely the way you can only cry when you are entirely alone. She had grieved the man she had married, the early version of him, the one who used to call her from his car, just to hear her voice, who had once driven 3 hours to bring her a book she mentioned wanting, who had sat with her through an entire night when her mother was sick. That man was gone. She had been grieving him for 2 years already. The crying was done. What remained was clarity. She looked out the car window at the city lights blurring past, and she thought about the phone call she had to make, the call she had been avoiding for years, the one that would pull her back into the world she had left, back into the name and the identity and the weight of everything she had run from. She thought about what her advisor Charles had said to her 4 months ago when she had first called to ask his advice about the marriage. He had said quietly and with infinite care, "Your Highness, if he continues down this path, you will have choices to make." She had told him she knew. She thought about what her grandmother had said decades ago in a stone library in a different world. "Our family has survived by understanding one thing, Claire. The most powerful person in any room is never the one making the most noise." She had been making no noise for 8 years. She pulled out her phone. Charles answered on the second ring. He always answered on the second ring because 1 ring was too eager and 3 was too slow, and Charles Harrington was a man who had spent 50 years managing the impossible logistics of one of the most powerful private dynasties in the world, and had learned that precision applied to everything, including telephone etiquette. "Your Highness," he said, and even in those 2 words she could hear the measured worry. He knew something had happened. He always knew. "Prepare everything," she said. A pause. Long enough to be significant. "Are you certain?" She looked back through the rear window at the lights of Beverly Crown growing smaller. "Yes, because the man who thought I was worthless is about to discover what he threw away." Another pause, and then very quietly, she heard something she had not heard from Charles Harrington in years. He laughed, not loudly, just a small, deeply satisfied sound, like a man who had been waiting a very long time for a particular chess piece to finally reach its position on the board. "Everything will be ready," he said, "within the week." What Alexander did not know, what almost nobody in Los Angeles knew, was that Claire Bennett had not always been Claire Bennett, or rather she had always been Claire Bennett, but she was also at the same time something else entirely. She was born Claire Alexandra Bennett of the House of Valemont, in a world that most Americans only read about in the kind of books she would later sell in her bookstore. The Valemont family was not famous in the way celebrities are famous. They were famous in the way tectonic plates are famous. Most people never saw them directly, but they shaped the landscape of everything around them. The family had been in private finance for 4 generations. They controlled a portfolio that, if it had been made public, would have placed them comfortably among the top 15 wealthiest private families in the Western world. Real estate across 3 continents, technology holdings, infrastructure projects, international foundations. A network of advisors, legal teams, and financial institutions so extensive that most people inside the Valemont operation had only a partial picture of its full scope. Claire was the only heir. Her parents had died when she was 23 within 8 months of each other. Her father first a heart attack quiet, and without warning the way big men sometimes go. Her mother 8 months later from what the doctors called complications and what the family understood as grief. Claire had gone through that year in a kind of stunned disbelief that she had never fully discussed with anyone. After the deaths, the full weight of the Valemont inheritance passed to her, and with it the expectation from family advisors, from board members, from the network of old money that surrounded her family, like a wall that she would step into her role and become exactly what they needed her to be. A symbol, a name, a figurehead to steady the empire. Claire was 24 years old, and she looked around at the people who needed her to perform a version of herself for their comfort, and she made a decision that everyone around her considered either very brave or very dangerous, depending on their perspective. She left. Not forever. Not without a plan. She was too precise for that. She transferred the operational management of the estate to Charles Harrington, who had been her father's most trusted advisor and who she trusted completely. She established a legal framework that allowed her to act as the decision-making authority on major matters remotely without requiring her physical presence or public identity. She put structures in place that would protect the family's interests during her absence. She covered every contingency she could think of, which was most of them, because Claire had always been exceptionally good at thinking ahead. And then she created a quiet, unremarkable identity for herself and moved to Los Angeles, where she used a modest portion of her personal inheritance to open a small antique bookstore in a neighborhood that did not cater to billionaires. She called it Second Chapter Books. She told almost no one who she was. The reason was simple, even if it took her years to articulate it. Clearly, she wanted to know what her life felt like without the weight of the name. She wanted to find out whether she was interesting without the fortune, whether people would value her company simply because of who she was as a human being, not because of what her surname could do for them. She knew it was unusual. She knew most people would think it was absurd, a billionaire heiress hiding in a bookstore. But she also knew something that most people never get the chance to know what it felt like to be truly seen, not as a symbol or a strategy, but as a person. She found that out unexpectedly in a small coffee shop on a Tuesday morning in March when a man at the next table knocked over his coffee, apologized profusely, and then noticing the book she was reading said, "Nabokov. Really, you don't look like a Nabokov person." She had looked at him and said, "What does a Nabokov person look like?" And he had laughed, actually laughed, surprised and delighted, and said, "I have no idea. I was just hoping you'd argue with me." That was Alexander. That was how it started. In the early years, he was genuinely good. She saw that clearly even now, even after everything. He was not performing when he was kind to her in those years. He was not pretending when he drove 3 hours with that book. The ambition was always there, but early on it coexisted with something real, a genuine curiosity, a real warmth, a capacity for the kind of attention that makes another person feel like the most important thing in the room. She had loved him completely. That was the part that made everything else so complicated. It would have been simpler if she had never loved him, if she had been wrong from the beginning. But she hadn't been wrong. She had loved a real person, and that person had been slowly, gradually, almost imperceptibly replaced by something harder and colder, and by the time she understood what was happening, she had already built 4 years of her life around him. She stayed for the 5th year, waiting to see if any fragment of the original man could survive his own success. The answer came with a manila folder at their anniversary party. In the week after the divorce signing, Alexander did 3 things. The first thing he did was call a press contact at the Los Angeles Business Journal and arrange for a carefully worded mention of his personal life transition to appear in the following week's business column. He had learned from watching other executives that the worst thing you could do when your personal life became public was to leave the story untold. Better to shape it. The mention was brief, neutral, and subtly framed him as a man focused on his work. The second thing he did was invite Victoria to move her personal items into the Bel Air house. The third thing he did was call Marcus Webb. Marcus came over the following morning. He sat across from Alexander in the study with his coffee and did not drink it, which was unusual because Marcus always drank his coffee immediately. "You need to know something," Marcus said. "If this is about the announcement, it's not about the announcement." Marcus put the cup down. "Alex, I need to know you actually know who you were married to." "What are you talking about?" "Claire, who her family is." Alexander sat back. "Her parents are both dead. She has no siblings. She ran a bookstore. Marcus, I have known the woman for 8 years. Marcus looked at him for a long moment. "Did she ever talk about her family? Her grandmother, where she grew up?" "She didn't like to talk about her past. I respected that." You respected it because it was convenient to respect it. Marcus paused. Alex, I did something after the party. I had someone run a background check, a thorough one. You had my wife investigated. My former wife, Marcus corrected gently. And yes, because I was standing in that room when you handed her that folder, and I watched her face, and Alex, she wasn't surprised. She wasn't hurt. She wasn't even angry. She looked like a woman who had just been given permission. That landed somewhere inside Alexander's chest in a way he didn't want to examine. The background check, Marcus continued, came back with things that don't add up. Her Social Security trail starts 8 years ago. Before that, there are records, but they're layered, protected. The kind of protection that costs serious money and requires serious legal infrastructure. You're telling me Claire had a secret. I'm telling you I don't know what Claire had. I'm telling you that the woman you just divorced with a $200,000 check may not be who you thought she was. Marcus finally picked up his coffee. And I'm telling you that in 6 weeks, the Valamont Foundation is announcing the final contractor for the American Infrastructure Project. $20 billion, Alex. That's 4 times our annual revenue. If we get it, every problem we have disappears. I know that. The Valamont Foundation is run by a woman named Claire Alexandra Bennett Valamont. Marcus paused. I found that out this morning. The silence in the study was complete. Alexander set down his own cup very carefully with the focused deliberateness of a man who is managing a significant physical response. What? He said. I know, Marcus said. That's not, I know. She would have told me. Alex! Marcus's voice was patient and sad in the way of someone who genuinely likes you and genuinely does not know how to make the next thing easier. Why would she have told you? When would she have told you? In the last 2 years, when did you ask her about herself? When did you sit down and say, Claire, tell me something real? Alexander didn't answer, because the answer was the kind of silence that tells its own story. The Valamont presentation, Marcus said quietly, is in 6 weeks, in Washington. I think you should go. Of course I should go. $20 billion. No. Marcus shook his head. Not just for the money. He stood up. You should go because I think you need to understand what you actually did that night. He walked to the door, then turned back. I've known you for 20 years, Alexander. You're brilliant and you're driven, and I have been proud to build something with you. But somewhere along the way, you stopped being a man and started being a brand. And the one person who knew the difference, the one person who still saw the man you just handed her a folder across an anniversary cake in front of 400 people. He looked at him steadily. I hope she's who I think she is, because I hope she has enough power to show you what that cost. He left. Alexander sat alone in his study for a long time. Outside, the Los Angeles morning was doing what Los Angeles mornings always did, indifferent and bright and continuing exactly as planned, regardless of what was happening inside any particular house. He picked up his phone. He scrolled to Claire's number. He stared at it for 3 full minutes. He did not call. The Valamont Grand Hall in Washington, D.C. had been built in 1923, which meant it had been standing long enough to have watched several empires come and go without much comment. Its walls were limestone, its columns were marble. It had hosted treaty signings and state dinners and the kinds of announcements that rearranged the financial landscape of the country in ways that didn't appear in the news for another decade. The morning of the contractor announcement, it was filled with 312 executives, investors, journalists, and government officials, all of them understanding that whoever walked away with the Valamont contract would have more power than any single company had held in the American infrastructure sector in 30 years. Alexander arrived early. He stood in the lobby with Marcus and 2 members of his legal team, and he felt the particular electricity of a room where everyone is pretending to be calm. He had been in rooms like this before. He was good in rooms like this. He knew how to carry himself, how to hold a conversation, how to project the exact right amount of confidence that stops short of arrogance. He shook hands with the CEO of a competitor firm, with a deputy secretary from the Department of Transportation, with 3 different journalists who all asked versions of the same question about Whitmore Global's position. He answered smoothly. He always answered smoothly. What he did not tell them was that Whitmore Global was drowning. He had not told anyone that. He had barely told himself. The company's financial position had been deteriorating for 14 months beneath the surface, below the line items that made it into the public reports. Risky acquisitions that hadn't paid off. Loans taken against projections that had since evaporated. The architecture of the company's public balance sheet was held together by confidence and reputation, and the understanding that as long as nobody looked too closely, the story would hold. The Valamont contract was not just an opportunity. It was in a way Alexander had not allowed himself to fully feel until this morning, the only exit from a situation that had been quietly becoming desperate. He needed this. He had never needed anything this badly. The doors to the main hall opened at 9:15. Everyone filed in. Alexander found his seat in the third row, close enough to the stage to be noticed far enough back to observe. The room settled. A representative of the Valamont Foundation took the podium, a tall, composed man in his 60s, speaking with the unhurried authority of someone who has been doing important things for a long time and no longer needs to prove it. He thanked the assembled guests. He outlined the scope of the infrastructure project. He spoke about the Valamont Foundation's commitment to quality, to long-term partnerships, to investing in companies that demonstrated not just financial strength but integrity. That word integrity hung in the air briefly. Alexander straightened in his seat. "And now," the representative said, "it is my profound honor to introduce the person who will announce today's decision." He paused. The kind of pause that speakers use when they understand what they are about to say will rearrange everything that follows. "Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome the chairwoman of the Valamont Foundation." Another pause. "Her Royal Highness Claire Alexandra Bennett Valamont." The room stood. 312 people rose to their feet simultaneously, with the particular disciplined respect of people who understand exactly who they are standing for. Alexander did not stand immediately. He stood because the people around him stood, and his body followed before his mind could direct it. And he stood with the expression of a man watching the world demonstrate very clearly and very publicly that it understood something he did not. She walked onto the stage. She wore ivory. Not white ivory, warm and precise, the kind of color that belongs in rooms with limestone walls. She wore it simply the way she wore everything. Her hair was up in the same clean style it had always been, and her posture was the same posture he had seen in their kitchen and their living room and across dinner tables for 5 years straight, unhurried, taking up exactly as much space as was needed and not performing any of it. She was completely identical to the woman he had always known. She was completely unrecognizable to him, because the room was standing for her, because the people he had spent his entire career trying to impress, the executives and the officials and the journalists, were on their feet out of respect before she had said a single word. She reached the podium. She looked out at the room, and for just one fraction of 1 second before she began speaking, her eyes found him. I didn't know how. 300 people in the room, and she moved through them and found him exactly the way she had always had an unnerving capacity to find the exact thing she was looking for without appearing to search. She looked at him. Her expression did not change. She looked back at the room. "Thank you," she said. "Please sit down." They sat. Her voice was the same. This was the thing that undid him, sitting in the third row of a Washington hall with the marble columns and the limestone walls. Her voice was exactly the same as it had always been, calm, clear, slightly warmer than her face suggested, the voice he had heard every morning for 5 years. "The Valamont Foundation," she said, "has spent 18 months evaluating the applicants for this contract. We looked at financial stability, we looked at operational history, we looked at leadership, and we looked at something that is harder to quantify, but ultimately more important than any of the other factors." She paused. "We looked at honesty." The words settled into the room. "Because we have found through many years and many partnerships that the companies most likely to deliver on a commitment of this scale are not necessarily the ones with the largest balance sheets or the most impressive marketing. They are the ones whose internal reality matches their external presentation, the ones who are in fact what they say they are." Alexander felt something cold moving through him. She continued, "Before I announce the recipient of this contract, I need to address something that the Foundation discovered during our due diligence process, something that in good conscience we cannot remain silent about." She looked down briefly at the podium. When she looked up, her expression was completely professional, completely calm, the same steady eyes he had been looking at for 8 years. "During our financial review process, our team identified documentation suggesting that one of the finalist companies has been operating with a significant discrepancy between its public financial statements and its actual financial position." The room shifted. 300 people who had been sitting in polished stillness were now very, very attentive. I will not speak this company's name from this podium. That is not how this foundation operates. What I will say is that the documentation has been referred to the appropriate regulatory authorities. And what I will say further is that any company that has reached this level of our consideration by misrepresenting its financial health has not only failed our evaluation, it has by its own choices disqualified itself from any future consideration. She let that land. The contract, she said, voice unchanged, goes to the Meridian Group, whose proposal demonstrated not only financial strength, but exactly the kind of transparent, verifiable integrity we require. The room applauded. Alexander did not applaud. He sat in the third row with his hands in his lap, and he understood with a clarity that was almost physical that the discrepancy she was referring to was Whitmore Global, that the documentation referred to his company's hidden debt, his inflated projections, the architecture of performance he had built over 14 months to keep the house of cards standing. She had known. She had known before she walked onto that stage, and she had stood at that podium and dismantled his empire without once saying his name, without anger, without theater, with the calm, precise efficiency of a woman who had learned over a very long time how to do necessary things without making them personal. He stood up. It was the wrong thing to do. He knew immediately that it was wrong, but he was standing before he could stop himself the way a person stands when something inside them refuses to remain seated. And she was still at the podium preparing to continue, and she looked at him. The room looked at him. "Claire," he said. His voice carried. The room was so quiet that it carried. She waited. "Why?" he said. It was not the right question. He knew it wasn't, but it was the only one he had. She looked at him for a moment that felt much longer than it was. "Because for 5 years," she said, and her voice was quiet, but the room had the acoustics of a building that had been designed to carry important words to every corner. "You never once asked who I really was." She turned back to the room. "Thank you all for being here today." The applause resumed. Alexander sat back down. Marcus, who had been 2 rows behind him, leaned forward and put a hand briefly on his shoulder. Just for a moment, the hand of a man who had seen this coming and had not been able to stop it. Outside the limestone walls of the Valemont Grand Hall, Washington was doing what it always did, indifferent and continuing as cities do, completely unmoved by any particular empire's decision to collapse. Inside, Alexander Whitmore sat very still in the third row and began for the first time in a very long time to understand the actual size of the mistake he had made 3 days after the Beverly Crown. Claire did not sleep the first night. Not because she was crying. She had already done that privately, completely in the weeks before the anniversary dinner, when she still held some thin hope that Alexander might pull back from the edge of whatever he was becoming. That hope died somewhere around the 4th month of watching Victoria Lane's name appear on his phone screen every morning before he got out of bed. By the night of the party, Claire had already grieved the marriage. What she had not yet done was decide what came next. She sat in the apartment above her bookstore, a space Alexander had always considered charmingly small and slightly embarrassing, though he had never said so directly, just implied it through the way he declined to bring business guests there, and she did not sleep. She made tea. She sat at her kitchen table with both hands around the mug, and she thought with the particular focused clarity that comes after the emotional work is finished and only the practical work remains. She thought about Charles Harrington. She thought about the phone call she had made from the car. She thought about what prepare everything actually meant in practical terms, when the everything in question was one of the largest private financial dynasties in the Western world that had been sitting in careful suspension for 8 years, waiting for its heir to decide she was ready. She was ready. The question now was not whether. The question was how. By 2 in the morning, she had a list, not written down. Claire rarely wrote things down because she had the kind of memory that organized itself precisely and retained what mattered. The list was in her head, ordered by priority with dependencies mapped and timelines approximated. She had always been this way even as a child. Her grandmother used to say she was born already knowing how rooms connected to each other. Her grandmother, Eleanor Valemont, 91 years old, sharp as broken glass, living in the family estate in Connecticut, in the particular state of alert stillness that very old women achieve when they have outlived every person who ever underestimated them. Claire had called her grandmother before she called Charles. Eleanor had answered on the first ring, which meant she had been awake, which meant she already knew something had happened, because Eleanor Vallimont had a network of quiet awareness that operated completely outside any technology Claire could explain. "Tell me," Eleanor had said. Just that. So Claire told her. All of it. The folder, the check, the words, the 400 guests, the way Alexander had turned his back before she could answer. Eleanor was silent for a moment. Then she said something Claire had not expected. "Good. Grandmother. I don't mean good that he hurt you. I mean good that it's finished. I was watching you disappear into that marriage, Claire. For the last 2 years I have watched you become smaller and smaller inside your own life, and I did not say anything because you needed to find your own way to the door." A pause. "Has he found it yet?" "Found what?" "The door to what he actually married." "No," Claire said. "Not yet." "Then give him time," Eleanor said. "Men like that always find it eventually, usually when it's too late to matter." She had laughed then, her grandmother, that dry, precise laugh that sounded like someone turning a page in a very old book and said, "Come home when you're ready, not before. The empire will hold." It had been holding for 8 years. It could hold a little longer. Claire put down her tea mug, went to her bedroom, and slept 4 hours. Exactly what she needed. She woke up already moving. Charles Harrington arrived in Los Angeles 48 hours later, not by commercial flight, because Charles Harrington had not flown commercial in 30 years. He arrived quietly, as he always did, with a single carry-on bag and a leather briefcase that never left his hand, and he met Claire in the back room of second chapter books, among the shelves of first editions, and the smell of old paper, and he sat across from her at the small wooden table she used as a desk and looked at her the way he had been looking at her since she was a child, with complete seriousness and absolute loyalty, and a kind of patient devotion that had nothing to do with her money or her name, and everything to do with the fact that he had watched her grow up and believed with no reservations that she was the finest person the Vallimont family had produced in 4 generations. "How are you?" he asked first. Not the business, her. "I'm fine," she said. "Genuinely. I need you to know that before we talk about anything else, because I need you operating from clarity, not concern." He studied her face for a moment. He was 71 years old, and he had the eyes of someone who had spent a lifetime reading the difference between what people said and what they meant. "All right," he said. "I believe you." "Good. Now tell me where we are." Charles opened the briefcase. He laid 3 documents on the table, each one precisely aligned the way he did everything. "The Vallimont Foundation has completed its preliminary evaluation for the infrastructure contract. The final announcement is in 11 weeks. You are the decision-making authority, as you have always been. Your absence from public life has been managed as planned. The board and the regulatory bodies have your signature on everything material. The operational decisions have been mine, and your identity has remained protected." He paused. "Whitmore Global Holdings submitted a proposal." Claire looked at him steadily. "I know. You knew before I told you. I suspected. Alexander had been chasing that contract for months. He mentioned it in passing, the way he mentioned things he considered my business, which is to say, barely. He said it was a federal infrastructure opportunity that could change the company's trajectory." She paused. His exact words were that it was the kind of deal that separates the real players from everyone else. Charles looked at her with something that was not quite a smile, but was in the vicinity of one. "And what would you like to do about it?" "I want our team to complete the evaluation exactly as they would for any other applicant. Full financial review, full operational history, full leadership assessment." She folded her hands on the table. "And I want it to be honest, whatever they find. Even if, especially if." She met his eyes. "I am not doing this for revenge, Charles. I need you to understand that. I am not going to use the Vallimont Foundation as a weapon. If Whitmore Global's financials are clean and their proposal is the strongest, they get the contract." A pause. "But I don't think their financials are clean." Charles was quiet for a moment. Then he reached into the briefcase and produced a 4th document. He placed it on the table without speaking. Claire looked at it. She read the first page. She turned to the second. Halfway through the second page, she set it down and looked at the wall for a moment, not because she was surprised, but because she was doing the particular quiet work of confirming something she had already suspected and feeling what it meant to have it confirmed. "How long?" she asked. 14 months, possibly longer, but our forensic team can only verify the last 14 with confidence. He's been hiding this for over a year." The public statements are entirely disconnected from the actual position, Charles said carefully. The loans are significant. The failed acquisitions are papered over with projected valuations that assume market conditions that no longer exist. And there are 3 investment vehicles that, on examination, appear to have been structured specifically to move liability off the visible balance sheet. Claire was quiet. "Claire," Charles said, and his voice had shifted, still professional, but with that particular gentleness he reserved for things that mattered beyond business. "This was happening while you were still in the marriage. I know. He was building this fiction while you were in the house, while you were—" "I know, Charles." Not sharp, just final. She picked up the document again. "This goes to the regulatory authorities as part of our due diligence disclosure process. Standard protocol as it would be for any applicant. We don't target him, we don't call him, we follow the process." "Understood. And the contract goes to whoever actually deserves it." She set the document down with the precision of someone placing a full stop at the end of a sentence. "Now, tell me about the announcement." What Charles told her next was the thing that shifted everything, from a decision into a reality. The Valamont Foundation's contractor announcement was scheduled for the Valamont Grand Hall in Washington, D.C. The event was expected to draw 300-plus attendees, executives, investors, federal officials, press. It was by any measure one of the most watched private foundation announcements in recent American business history. And it had been planned for months, as the moment Claire Alexandra Bennett Valamont returned to public life. She had agreed to it before the divorce, before Alexander handed her the folder. She had agreed to it because the foundation required a public face, because 8 years of operating in the shadows had begun to create operational complications that required her visible authority, and because Eleanor, who was rarely wrong about anything, had told her quietly that there was a time for hiding and a time for standing up, and that the two were not interchangeable. She had not known then that Alexander would hand her the folder 11 weeks before the announcement. Sitting across from Charles in the back room of her bookstore, Claire understood that the timing was not something she had engineered. It had simply arrived. Life had a way of doing that, stacking things in an order that looked in retrospect like intention. Even when it was just the accumulation of separate decisions made at separate times, finally arriving at the same intersection. "The announcement date holds," she said. "Of course," Charles said. "And my appearance." "Yes." She stood up. She walked to the window and looked out at the bookstore floor, the shelves, the reading chairs, the particular piece of a space built for quiet attention. She had loved this place. She genuinely loved it. That was something she needed to hold on to in the weeks ahead. The fact that this life she had built, this small and unhurried life, had been real. It had not been performance or hiding or waiting. It had been real, and she had been happy in it, and that happiness was hers and nobody's business, and nobody could take it by reframing it as something lesser. "One more thing," she said, still looking at the bookstore floor. "Yes. When I walk onto that stage, I want it to be exactly who I am, not a performance, not a statement. I want to walk out there and simply be present the way I have always been present. And I want the room to understand that the woman they are looking at has always been that woman, not that she became her, that she always was." Charles was quiet for a moment. "Yes, Your Highness," he said softly. She turned back, and for a moment the title sat in the air of the small back room above a Los Angeles bookstore with a particular weight that was not burden and was not pride, but was something in between, a thing that belonged to her that she had set down for 8 years and was now carefully and deliberately picking back up. Meanwhile, on the other side of Los Angeles, Alexander Whitmore was making phone calls he should not have needed to make. The morning after Marcus Webb's visit, the morning after Marcus had said, "Your former wife may not be who you thought she was," and left Alexander sitting alone in his study, Alexander had done something he very rarely did. He panicked. Not outwardly. Outwardly, he was precise and controlled, because outward precision was the armor he had spent 20 years building, and he wore it reflexively the way some people breathe. But inwardly beneath the armor, something was moving very fast and not in a good direction. He called his head of legal, Daniel Forsyth, at 6:45 in the morning. Daniel answered with the resigned alertness of a man who had been on Alexander's legal team for 11 years and understood that early morning calls from his employer always meant something had gone wrong. "I need everything we have on Claire," Alexander said. "Her family background, her financial history, everything." A pause. "I thought the divorce was straightforward." It was. This is something different. Alex, just do it, Daniel. Daniel did it. By noon, he was in Alexander's study with a folder of his own, and the expression on his face was the particular expression of a lawyer who has discovered something he would have much preferred not to discover. "What did you find?" Alexander asked. Daniel sat down. He did not open the folder immediately, which was unlike him. He spent a moment looking at the cover of it, as though considering whether the contents would change less if delivered more slowly. "Her name," Daniel said, "is Claire Alexandra Bennett Valamont." Alexander said nothing. "The Valamont family," Daniel continued, "controls a private investment portfolio that our analysts estimate at between $40 and $60 billion, depending on valuation methodology. They have holdings in 17 countries. They have been operating as a private dynasty since the 1920s. He paused. "She is the sole heir. She's the—" Alexander stopped. Tried again. "She is the heir to the Valamont family." "Yes." "The same Valamont Foundation that is announcing the infrastructure contract." "Yes." "She controls the contract decision." "According to everything we can find, yes. She is the chairwoman. She has been the decision-making authority for the foundation since—" Daniel checked the document. "Since 8 years ago, when she was 24, after her parents died. 8 years ago, the same year she moved to Los Angeles. The same year she opened the bookstore. The same year she sat in a coffee shop reading Nabokov and told him she had no idea what a Nabokov person looked like." Alexander stood up. He walked to the window of his study, the same window he had stood at the morning after the divorce looking out at the Los Angeles morning that didn't care, and he put both hands on the frame and looked out and breathed. "Why?" he said very quietly to the window. "Why didn't she tell me?" Daniel, to his credit, did not answer this question because he understood it was not actually being asked of him. What Alexander was feeling standing at that window was not a simple thing. It was not simply guilt, though guilt was in there. It was not simply the terror of a businessman who has just realized he may have destroyed his own most valuable relationship. It was something more complicated and more personal than either of those things. And it was this: he was beginning to understand that for 5 years he had been sharing his life with a woman he had never once been curious about. He had known she was private. He had known she didn't talk about her past. He had told himself, and occasionally told other people, that he respected her privacy, that her quiet self-containment was one of the things he loved about her. But Marcus had said it exactly right. He had respected it because it was convenient to respect it, because Claire's mystery cost him nothing, because he could have her beside him, her calm, her intelligence, her presence, without having to invest the kind of attention that actual curiosity requires. He had not asked. In 5 years, he had not sat down and said, "Claire, where do you come from? Claire, who were your parents? Claire, what do you want from your life beyond this bookstore and this marriage and this quiet, careful world you've built?" He had loved the version of her that served his life. He had not been interested in the version of her that existed beyond it. "What do I do?" he said, still to the window. Daniel cleared his throat. "From a legal and business standpoint, the most important thing is whether Whitmore Global's proposal can withstand the Foundation's financial review." Alexander turned from the window. "Can it?" Daniel asked carefully. Alexander looked at his lawyer for a long moment. And in that moment, something shifted between them, the particular shift that happens when two people who have been operating in the polite fiction of professional relationship suddenly find themselves in the territory of actual truth. "No," Alexander said. The word was quiet. It cost him something to say it. Daniel could see that. "How bad?" Daniel asked. "Bad enough that if their forensic team is thorough—" Alexander stopped. "And it will be thorough. It will be thorough because she is thorough. She has always been thorough. I just never paid enough attention to notice." He sat back down. "If their review is complete, they will find the loan structures, the acquisition valuations, the liability transfers." Daniel was quiet for a long moment. "Then we need to think about what comes next, not the contract, what comes after." "What comes after is that the company collapses," Alexander said flatly. "If the Foundation discloses what they find to the regulatory bodies, which they are legally required to do, if their review surfaces material misrepresentation, then the investor confidence structure falls apart. The loans get called, the board panics." He paused. "And I lose everything." He said it without drama. Just the words, just the truth, which he had been keeping at arm's length for 14 months, and which had now walked directly into the room and sat down across from him. Daniel leaned forward. There may be options. If we go to the regulators proactively before the Foundation's disclosure— No. Alexander shook his head. It's too late for that. The timing would be transparent. He looked at his hands. What I need to do is think about something other than the company. What else is there? Daniel asked, genuinely confused. I need to think about Claire. Daniel blinked. Alex, I need to think about whether there is anything at this point that honesty could do. He looked up. Not for the business. I'm not talking about strategy. I'm talking about whether I owe her an actual conversation, not a negotiation, not a plea, a conversation. Daniel was a lawyer. This was not his territory. He sat back and said nothing, which was the right thing to do. Alexander picked up his phone. He looked at her name, Claire. Just her name. He had never put a last name in his contacts because he had only ever known her as one thing. He did not call. Not yet. He needed to understand something first. He needed to understand how a person can share a life with someone for 5 years and remain at the essential level a stranger. He needed to understand how that had happened. Not because understanding it would fix it. He was not naive enough to believe that, but because he was 41 years old, and he had spent those years becoming powerful and respected and admired, and he was sitting in his study, understanding that he did not actually know how to know another person. That was a terrible thing to understand about yourself, but it was the first honest thing he had understood in a very long time. 6 weeks before the Washington announcement, Marcus called. You're still going to submit the proposal, Marcus said. It was not a question. We've already submitted it, Alexander said. Months ago, before I— He stopped. Before everything. I know. I'm asking whether you're going to show up for the announcement. Silence. Alex, I don't know what I would do there, Marcus. You would watch, Marcus said simply. You would watch and you would understand. And whatever happens after that, at least you would understand it with your eyes open instead of— He paused. Instead of the way you've been operating. The way I've been operating, Alexander repeated. You mean with my eyes closed? I mean with your attention on everything except what was right in front of you. Marcus's voice was not unkind. It was the voice of someone who cared enough to be honest. She was right there, Alex. 8 years, 5 of them married. She was right there, and you looked past her at every conference, every dinner, every party, because she didn't fit the version of success you were performing. A pause. She was the most interesting person in every room you were ever in together, and you never knew it. Alexander thought about the coffee shop. 20 years ago. She had said, "What does a Nabokov person look like?" And he had laughed. He had been drawn to her precisely because of that. The quality in her that questioned assumptions, that refused easy categories, that looked at the world with the quiet intelligence of someone who had already thought more carefully than most people ever would. He had loved that quality. And then somewhere in the building of an empire, he had stopped looking for it. "I'll go to Washington," he said. "Good," Marcus said. "It's not going to help the company." "No," Marcus agreed. "It's not." "Then why are you telling me to go?" Marcus was quiet for a moment. Then he said something Alexander would think about for a very long time afterward. "Because the company was never the most valuable thing you had, and I think it's time you had to stand somewhere and understand that." The weeks between that conversation and the Washington announcement were the strangest of Alexander's adult life. He continued to run the company in the mechanical sense: meetings, calls, decisions. The infrastructure of professional life that continues even when the person at its center has lost his conviction about what it's for. But underneath all of it, something was working. Something quiet and uncomfortable was turning over in him, the way ground turns over when something is growing beneath it. He started paying attention, not to business, to people, to the conversations happening around him that he had been processing as background noise for years. To Marcus, who was smarter and kinder than Alexander had given him credit for. To his executive team, several members of whom he began to notice were genuinely excellent in ways he had never acknowledged. To the things people said when they thought he wasn't listening, and he thought about Claire. He thought about the way she had picked up the pen, the steadiness of her hands, the particular quality of the look she had given him, not hatred, not satisfaction, not grief. Something beyond all of those, something that the more he thought about it, the more he understood was a kind of completion, like a woman closing the final page of a book she had already read to the end. She had been prepared. For how long? He turned that question over and over in the quiet of his study in the early mornings before the city was fully awake. For how long had she known? For how long had she been sitting beside him, in possession of a life and a name and a power that dwarfed everything he had built, and simply choosing not to use it? Choosing to be Claire from the bookstore, the quiet wife, the woman everyone underestimated. What kind of person did that? And then gradually the answer, the kind of person who genuinely did not need the power to feel valuable. The kind of person who had walked away from a dynasty because she wanted to find out who she was without it. The kind of person whose sense of self was so fundamentally located inside herself that the presence or absence of a billion-dollar name made no actual difference to how she moved through a room. The exact kind of person he was not. He understood that now. He had spent 20 years becoming powerful because somewhere underneath all of it, he had needed to. He had needed the external architecture of success to feel real, to feel substantial, to feel like the kind of person worth taking seriously. Claire had never needed that. She had carried her own gravity from the beginning. He had mistaken her quiet for emptiness. She had simply been full in ways that didn't make noise. The day before the Washington announcement, Alexander sat in his hotel room and took out his phone. He looked at her name for a long time. Then he typed a message, looked at it and deleted it, typed another, deleted it. Finally he wrote, "I know tomorrow is not the time. But I want you to know that I am beginning to understand what I actually lost. Not the contract, not what any of this means for the company. You. I am beginning to understand that I lost you, and I think I lost you long before I handed you that folder." He stared at it for 3 minutes. He sent it. The response came 4 hours later. One line. "You didn't lose me, Alexander. You let me go. There's a difference." He read it 6 times. He put the phone down. He sat in the Washington hotel room, and he thought about that difference between losing something and letting something go, and he thought about how long he had been letting go every day, in every small choice, to not look up to, not ask, to not be curious, and he thought about how those small choices had accumulated into the single large choice of a folder on an anniversary cake. He thought about it for a long time. Tomorrow he would sit in the 3rd row of the Valemont Grand Hall and watch the woman he had handed a $200,000 settlement check take the podium in a room where 300 powerful people would stand up for her before she said a word. And he would finally completely understand who he had been standing next to all along. The morning of the announcement, Alexander woke at 4:53. Not because his alarm went off, because sleep had simply stopped working somewhere around 3 in the morning, and his body had given up pretending. He lay in the Washington hotel room in the particular stillness of a man who has been turning the same thought over for hours and has run out of new angles to approach it from. "You didn't lose me, Alexander. You let me go. There's a difference." He had read that message so many times the night before that the words had stopped being words and become something else, a rhythm, a weight, a thing that sat in the center of his chest and did not move, regardless of how he positioned himself. He got up. He showered. He put on his best suit charcoal, the one he wore when he needed to walk into a room and be taken seriously, and he stood in front of the hotel mirror and looked at himself for a long moment. The square jaw, the dark eyes, the practiced composure that had never once failed him in a business setting. He looked like Alexander Whitmore, CEO of Whitmore Global Holdings, successful, authoritative, in control. He looked like a man who had no idea how much was about to change. His phone buzzed at 6:15. "Marcus." "You awake?" Marcus asked. "Since before 5. "Good. That means you're taking this seriously." A pause. "How are you?" "I don't know," Alexander said, which was the most honest answer he had given anyone in longer than he could calculate. Marcus was quiet for a moment. The Meridian Group arrived last night. Their CEO had dinner with 2 Valemont board members. That's not a good sign for us. "Marcus, I know it's not why you came. I'm just telling you because you need to know the full picture." Another pause. "Daniel called me this morning. He's been monitoring the regulatory filings. There's nothing yet, but he says if the Foundation's forensic review was complete, the disclosure window is this week." Alexander sat down on the edge of the bed. "This week. Possibly today, possibly in conjunction with the announcement." Marcus's voice was careful. "Alex, I need you to be prepared for the possibility that today is not just the day you watch Claire take that stage. It may be the day that everything we've built goes into the public record." The silence between them was heavy with 14 months of financial decisions Alexander wished he could unmake. "I know," Alexander said. "Do you want me to?" "No, I'll be there. I'll sit in that room and I'll watch it the way it happens. No managing, no positioning." He paused. "I'm done performing." Quietly, "That might be the most grown-up thing I've ever heard you say." They hung up. Alexander sat with his phone in his hand and thought about what Marcus had said months ago, that somewhere along the way he had stopped being a man and started being a brand. He had dismissed that when he first heard it the way people dismiss things that are too accurate to be comfortable. He was not dismissing it now. At 7:45, he took a car to the Valemont Grand Hall. He arrived to find the building already alive with the particular electricity of an event where everyone understands the stakes are real. Cars pulling up, security at every entrance, press clustered near the side entrance with cameras, and the barely contained energy of people who know they are about to witness something significant. Alexander walked through the main entrance without making eye contact with the press. One journalist called his name. He kept walking. Two of his board members were in the lobby, Raymond Chow and Patricia Hastings, and they both saw him and both immediately looked at each other with the particular glance of people calibrating whether to approach or hold their position. Patricia approached. She was 62, former federal judge, the most composed person Alexander had ever hired, and the fact that she was visibly uncertain told him more about how bad things actually were than anything Daniel Forsyth had said on the phone. "Alexander," she said. "Patricia, Raymond and I have been talking." She kept her voice low, though the lobby noise provided adequate cover. "We need to speak with you, after the announcement." "I know. There are things the board needs to address. Questions about the Q3 filings, about the Caldwell acquisition valuation." "I know, Patricia." She looked at him for a moment. Something in his steadiness confused her. She had been expecting defensiveness or calculated calm or the particular brand of aggressive confidence Alexander usually deployed when cornered. She was not expecting this quiet, this absence of performance. "Are you all right?" she asked, and the question was genuine. "Not particularly," he said, "but I'm here, and after today I'll sit down with you and Raymond and I will tell you everything. All of it. No more managed disclosure." He looked at her steadily. "It's time." Patricia held his gaze for a moment. Then she nodded once and stepped back. Alexander walked into the main hall and found his seat in the third row. The room filled steadily around him. He recognized faces from every sector: infrastructure, finance, federal contracting, real estate. The density of money and influence in the room was extraordinary, the kind of concentration that only happened when something genuinely large was at stake. People who ran empires sitting in rows waiting. Marcus slid into the seat beside him at 8:55. He said nothing. He put his hand briefly on Alexander's shoulder, the same gesture he had made in this same hall at the end of Part 1, when the world had already shifted and words were no longer sufficient. Alexander acknowledged it with a nod. They sat together and waited. At 9:15, the doors at the front of the hall opened. The Valemont Foundation representative took the podium. The room settled into the particular attentive silence of 300 people who know the next 20 minutes will matter. And then he said the words, "Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome the chairwoman of the Valemont Foundation, Her Royal Highness Claire Alexandra Bennett Valemont." The room stood. 312 people, all of them, simultaneously. Alexander stood because the people around him stood, and because his body understood something before his mind could articulate it, that what was happening in this room was not simply a business announcement, it was a recognition. The room was on its feet because these 300 people who between them had seen virtually everything the American business world had to offer, understood that the woman walking toward that stage was someone who commanded that response. She walked exactly the way she had always walked. That was the thing. That was the thing that hit him like a physical impact when she came through the door and moved toward the stage. She walked the same way she walked into their kitchen in the morning. The same posture, the same pace, the same quality of movement that had no performance in it, that simply occupied space without announcing itself. The ivory gown, her hair up, the same face he had looked at across 1,000 breakfasts and dinner tables, and the particular darkness of 3 in the morning when one of them couldn't sleep. Completely identical to the woman he had always known, completely devastatingly unrecognizable to him, because the room was standing for her. I understood in that moment viscerally and completely what Marcus had meant. She had been the most powerful person in every room they had ever shared. She had simply never required anyone to know it. She reached the podium, she looked out at the room, and she found him. I did not know how she did it. 300 people between them, and her eyes moved through the room and landed on him with the same quiet precision she applied to everything. 1 second. 2. Her expression did not change. Then she looked back at the room. "Thank you," she said. "Please sit down." Her voice, exactly the same. The thing that undid him most completely was that her voice was exactly the same. "The Valamont Foundation," she began, "has spent 18 months evaluating the applicants for this contract. We looked at financial stability, we looked at operational history, we looked at leadership, and we looked at something that is harder to quantify, but ultimately more important than any of the other factors." She paused. Let the room settle into the pause. "We looked at honesty." The word landed in the room and stayed there. "Because we have found over many years and many partnerships that the companies most likely to deliver on a commitment of this scale are not necessarily the ones with the largest balance sheets. They are the ones whose internal reality matches their external presentation, the ones who are in fact exactly what they say they are." Alexander's hands were still in his lap. He was not moving. He was listening with the complete, helpless attention of a man hearing something he cannot argue with. "Before I announce today's recipient," Claire continued, "I need to address something our team encountered during due diligence, something that in good conscience we cannot remain silent about." The room shifted, that invisible ripple of heightened attention. "During our financial review, we identified documentation suggesting that one of the finalist companies has been operating with a significant discrepancy between its public financial statements and its actual financial position." Marcus beside Alexander did not move, did not look at him, kept his eyes forward. "I will not name this company from this podium. That is not how this foundation operates, and it is not who I am." A brief pause. "What I will say is that the documentation has been referred to the appropriate regulatory authorities as part of our standard disclosure protocol. And what I will say further is that any company that reached this level of our consideration by misrepresenting its financial health has by its own choices disqualified itself from any future consideration by this foundation." She let that sit for exactly 3 seconds. "The contract is awarded to the Meridian Group." The room applauded. Solid, genuine, the sound of 300 people who respected a decision made transparently and without theater. Alexander did not applaud. He sat with his hands in his lap, and he felt the thing that he had been building for 14 months begin in real time to come apart, not with a crash. That was not how real things fell. They came apart the way ice does in spring, slowly, then suddenly, with a sound that seems too quiet for the scale of the collapse. He thought, "This is what I built, not the company, the collapse. I built this." And then before he had finished thinking it, he was standing. He did not decide to stand. His body made the decision, and he followed it the way he had been following his instincts, his entire career, except that every instinct he had ever followed had been about winning, and this one was not about winning at all. He stood up in the 3rd row of the Valamont Grand Hall, and Claire was still at the podium preparing to close, and she looked at him. The room looked at him. 300 people turned in their seats to find the source of the disruption and found Alexander Whitmore standing in the 3rd row in his best charcoal suit, looking at his ex-wife across the distance of a Washington hall and whatever else had accumulated between them. "Claire," he said. Absolute silence. She waited. She was very good at waiting. "Why?" he said. I knew it was the wrong question. He knew it even as he said it, that it was too small for everything it was trying to hold, that it didn't do justice to any of the things he actually needed to say. But it was what came out, because it was the question underneath all the other questions, the one that had been sitting in the center of his chest since 4:53 that morning. She looked at him for a long moment. "Because for 5 years," she said, and her voice was calm, but the room's acoustics carried it to every corner, "you never once asked who I really was." She held his gaze for one more second. Then she turned back to the room with the finality of a woman who has said the thing that needed to be said and has nothing to add to it. "Thank you all for being here today." The applause resumed. Alexander sat back down. Marcus put his hand on his shoulder again, briefly. The hand of a man who had watched this coming for months and had not been able to change the direction of it, and who understood that some things can only be witnessed, not prevented. What happened in the 48 hours after the announcement was not slow. The regulatory disclosure from the Valamont Foundation reached the Securities and Exchange Commission at 4:17 that same afternoon. By 5 o'clock, the filing was visible in the public database, which meant that by 5:33, financial journalists had found it. By 6, it was on the wire services. By 7, the first piece ran under the headline, Whitmore Global Holdings under SEC Review Following Foundation Disclosure. Alexander was in the car back to his hotel when his phone started. He watched the notifications come in with the detached calm of a man in the middle of something he can no longer stop and has decided to stop trying to stop. Daniel called. He answered. "I know," he said. "I know, yes, I know." He hung up. Raymond Chow called. Same conversation. Patricia Hastings called, and he let her talk for 2 full minutes because Patricia had earned the right to say what she needed to say, and then he said, "Board meeting, tomorrow morning. I'll be there. I'll tell them everything." He hung up and looked out the car window at Washington going about its evening and thought about Claire saying, "You never once asked who I really was." I thought about a morning about 3 years into the marriage when he had come downstairs at 6:30 and found her at the kitchen table with a stack of papers, dense financial, the kind of documents he associated with serious work. She had gathered them up when she heard him coming and put them aside and poured his coffee, and they had talked about his day, his meetings, his deals. He had not asked what she was reading. He had not asked once. I thought about a dinner maybe 2 years after that, when she had said carefully over the kind of meal she always prepared with quiet precision. "I've been thinking about a foundation, something focused on economic access for women who are starting over." She had said it simply the way she said everything, and he had said, "That sounds nice, Claire," and moved the conversation to a merger he was considering, and she had nodded and listened and never mentioned the foundation again. The Bennett Foundation for Second Chances. He had read about it in the press materials distributed at the Valamont announcement, established by Claire Alexandra Bennett Valamont, focused on providing economic resources and support infrastructure for people who had lost themselves trying to meet someone else's expectations. She had built the thing she told him about at dinner 2 years ago. She had built it without him. She had built it while he was building his empire and not paying attention, and it was already, according to the press materials, operating in 11 states, with a budget that made his own corporate social responsibility program look like a suggestion. She had always been building. He had just never looked. The board meeting the next morning was one of the most difficult things Alexander had done in his professional life, and he had done genuinely difficult things. He walked in at 9 o'clock and he sat at the head of the table and he looked at the 11 faces of the people who had trusted him with their investment and their careers and their professional reputations, and he told them the truth, all of it. He did not manage it. He did not frame it strategically or position it for minimal damage or use the particular language of corporate crisis communication that he had watched other executives deploy like a shield. He told them what had happened in the order it had happened, with the specific numbers and the specific decisions and the specific moments when he had known that the direction he was taking was unsustainable and had chosen to keep going anyway. It took 2 hours. When he finished, the room was completely quiet. Patricia Hastings spoke first. "What are you recommending?" "I'm recommending a full audit, complete regulatory cooperation, and a restructuring process that protects the employees and the core operational business as much as possible while addressing the debt position honestly." He paused. "I am also recommending that the board consider my resignation as CEO." Another silence. Raymond Chow, who had been with the company for 9 years and who Alexander had always considered his most reliable board member, leaned forward. "You're offering to step down." "I'm not offering. I'm recommending. There's a difference." He said it without intending the echo, then heard it. "You didn't lose me, Alexander. You let me go. There's a difference. The company needs leadership that the market will trust during a restructuring. My name is currently a liability. That's a fact, and I'm not going to pretend otherwise." Raymond looked at Patricia. Patricia looked at the rest of the board. Something moved around the table, not forgiveness exactly, not absolution. Something more pragmatic than either of those things, but not without its own kind of weight. "We'll need time to deliberate," Patricia said. "Of course," Alexander said. He left the boardroom and stood in the hallway outside it and breathed, just breathed, the particular relief of having finally told the truth, not because the truth solved anything, but because the energy that had gone into not telling it was suddenly available for something else. He felt lighter and more frightened simultaneously, which was he realized what honesty actually felt like. He had forgotten. Marcus was waiting in the hallway. He was leaning against the wall with his arms crossed and the look of a man who had been there for a while. "How bad?" Marcus asked. "As bad as it needed to be," Alexander said. "I told them everything." Marcus studied him. And I recommended my own resignation." Marcus was quiet for a moment. Then he did something Alexander had not expected. He uncrossed his arms, and he said quietly, and without any performance in it, "I'm proud of you." Alexander looked at him. "Marcus, I know it doesn't fix anything. I know it doesn't undo any of it. But I've been your partner for 20 years, and I watched you sit in that boardroom and tell the truth without a net, and I'm telling you that is the first time in at least 3 years that I've seen the man I went into business with." He paused. "He's still in there." Alexander did not trust himself to respond to that immediately, so he said nothing, and Marcus understood because Marcus had always understood, and they stood in the hallway outside the boardroom together in the particular silence of two men who have been through something significant and know that what comes next will require everything they have left. What came next over the following 72 hours was the public unraveling of Whitmore Global Holdings. It was not quiet. When a company of that size and public profile comes under regulatory scrutiny, the story moves fast and loud. The financial press covered it with the relentless thoroughness that major corporate scandals always generate. Every decision Alexander had made over 14 months was dissected, contextualized, criticized. Former business associates offered careful quotes that managed to be both distancing and sympathetic. Investment analysts downgraded the stock before trading was halted. The loans that had been structured to stay invisible were now the most visible things in the American financial press. And Victoria Lane, who had moved her things into the Bel Air house 6 weeks ago with the proprietary confidence of a woman who had won something called Alexander on the second day of the coverage and said she needed to talk. She came to the house. She sat across from him in the living room that had been decorated to specifications he could not remember agreeing to, and she said with the particular directness of someone who has decided that being diplomatic is no longer worth the investment, "I think we should take some time apart while this is resolved." Alexander looked at her. He thought about what it said about him that he felt almost nothing. Not relief, not loss, not the particular sting of abandonment, just a mild, tired recognition. "All right," he said. She had expected more. He could see that. She had expected what a plea maybe, or anger, something that confirmed she had mattered enough to produce a reaction. The absence of a reaction was, he suspected, the most honest response he had ever given her and the most unwelcome. She left within the hour. He sat alone in the house after she went in the living room with the decor he didn't remember choosing, and he thought about the 5 years of marriage to a woman he had never asked about, and the 6 weeks of something with a woman he had never actually known, and he thought about the fundamental loneliness of a life built on performing rather than connecting. He picked up his phone. He pulled up Claire's message. "You didn't lose me, Alexander. You let me go. There's a difference." He typed, "I've been thinking about what you said. I think I understand the difference now. I let go of you in small ways every day for years. Long before I handed you that folder, I was so focused on building something that I forgot to notice what I already had." He stared at it, added, "I'm not asking for anything. I just needed to say it honestly at least once." He sent it. This time, the response came within the hour. "I know you are," she wrote. "I've known for a while. That's why I never hated you. You can't hate someone for not seeing what they were never taught to look for." He read it twice, 3 times. Then he typed, "The board is meeting to discuss my resignation. I think I'm going to let them accept it." A pause. Then her response. "That sounds like the first decision you've made in a long time that's actually about who you are rather than what you're trying to protect." He sat with that for a long time. Outside Washington was doing what it always did, continuing without consultation, indifferent to individual reckoning. Inside, Alexander Whitmore was sitting with the slow, unfamiliar, genuinely difficult work of understanding himself honestly, which is harder than building a company, and less impressive to observe from the outside, and more important than either of those things. The board accepted his resignation 3 days later. I did not fight it. He sat in the boardroom and he signed the documents that Patricia Hastings prepared, and he shook hands with each board member individually, and he said to each of them something specific and true about what they had contributed, about what he had observed in their work, about what he respected. Not as strategy, not as a parting performance, because he had been trying in the past 72 hours to actually see people, to practice the thing he had failed so completely to do for years. Most of them were surprised. A few of them were visibly moved, which surprised him in return. Raymond Chow last gripped his hand and said, "Whatever comes next, I mean that. Whatever direction you take from here." Alexander nodded. "I'm working on figuring that out," he said, and that was true. He walked out of the Whitmore Global building on a Tuesday afternoon and stood on the sidewalk outside it and looked up at the facade, the glass, the steel, the name on the building in letters that were, he had always privately thought, slightly too large. He looked at it for a long moment. Then he turned and walked away from it without looking back. It was the most honest exit he had ever made in his career, and it was the one that had no audience, no cameras, and no applause. It was the one that cost him the most. It was the one that he was beginning to understand might eventually be worth the most. 3 blocks away in a coffee shop that had no connection to anything significant. He sat down at a small table by the window and ordered coffee and took out a notebook, a physical one-paper, which he had not used in years, and he began to write. Not a business plan, not a strategic framework, just things he was thinking, things he was understanding, things that if he was honest with himself, he had been avoiding thinking for a very long time. He wrote for 2 hours. When he stopped, he had 12 pages. He looked at them messy, unorganized, the handwriting of a man thinking too fast for his pen, and he felt something he had not felt in so long that he had to sit with it for a moment before he could name it. He felt like himself. Not Alexander Whitmore, CEO, not the brand, the reputation, the charcoal suit, and the calculated handshake. Just a man, sitting in a coffee shop, trying to figure out what he actually believed. He put the notebook in his jacket pocket. He ordered another coffee. He sat by the window and watched the street outside, people moving past, unhurried and purposeful, and completely unaware of any particular empire's collapse, and for the first time in years, he was not performing for them. He was simply there. It was a small thing. It was the smallest possible beginning, but it was real, and it was his, and in the economy of a life that had been built on performance for so long, real and small, turned out to be worth considerably more than large and false. Across the city, in a different office. Claire Alexandra Bennett, Valamont, was in a meeting with Charles Harrington and 3 members of her foundation's operating board, reviewing the first quarter projections for the Bennett Foundation's expansion. She was precise and focused and entirely herself, the woman from the bookstore and the woman from the Grand Hall, both at once because they had always been the same woman. At 2:47, her phone buzzed. She glanced at it beneath the conference table. "Alexander Y. walked out of the building today, for the last time. I'm sitting in a coffee shop trying to figure out who I am without the company. It's harder than I expected. I think that probably tells me something." She read it once. She put her phone face down on her lap. She looked at the projections on the table. She thought about the 11 states where her foundation was already operating. She thought about the women it had already helped, women who had built their lives around someone else's version of success and had needed a door back to themselves. She thought about the fact that Alexander Whitmore, sitting in a coffee shop somewhere in Washington with a notebook he hadn't used in years, was doing the hardest thing she had ever watched a proud man do. She thought about Eleanor saying men like that always find the door eventually, usually when it's too late to matter. She picked up her phone. She typed, "Good. Stay in the coffee shop. Figure it out. It takes as long as it takes." She set the phone down and looked back at the projections. Charles across the table had noticed the brief pause. He said nothing. He was 71 years old, and he had learned over a very long career that some conversations are private, even when they happen in plain sight. The meeting continued, outside in a city that had already moved on to its next story. 2 people were sitting in separate rooms doing the particular slow work of becoming more honest versions of themselves, one of them because she had always known who she was and was simply coming home to it, and one of them because he was learning for the first time that knowing who you are is not something that happens automatically just because you know what you've built. It is something you have to choose deliberately every single day, and the choosing he was discovering was the whole point. The coffee shop notebook became a habit, not the same coffee shop. Alexander was no longer in Washington after the third day. He drove back to Los Angeles in a rental car instead of flying, which surprised even him because Alexander Whitmore had not driven himself anywhere significant in 4 years. But he needed the hours. He needed the specific quality of time that only moving through the physical world at ground level provides, the towns appearing and disappearing, the landscape shifting the simple animal reality of being in a body, traveling through space without an agenda to perform. He stopped twice, once for gas and once because he passed a diner outside of Barstow that looked like it had been there since 1962, and something in him needed to sit in a place that had no connection to anything he had built or destroyed. He ordered eggs and coffee from a woman named Darlene, who called him Hun without irony, and refilled his cup without being asked. And he sat in the vinyl booth and opened his notebook and wrote for 40 minutes while truckers and retired couples and a family with 3 loud children moved around him like weather. He wrote about his father. He had not thought about his father consciously in years, which told him something. His father, Robert Whitmore, had been a man of modest achievement and enormous dignity, a high school history teacher in Sacramento who coached debate red voraciously and spent his Saturday mornings building furniture in his garage with the patient precision of someone who understood that the value of a thing is in how carefully you make it. Robert Whitmore had died of a stroke when Alexander was 32, 3 years before Whitmore Global became the kind of company whose CEO got profiled in magazines. Alexander had always told himself his father would have been proud. Sitting in the diner outside Barstow, he wrote, "I don't actually know if that's true. Dad was proud of things that were real. He would have seen the performance. He always saw the performance." He stared at that for a while. Then he wrote Claire would have liked him. They were the same kind of person. The kind who are interested in what's actually there rather than what's presented. He paid the check, left a tip that made Darlene look twice, and drove the rest of the way to Los Angeles. He arrived at the Bel Air house at 11:40 at night. He stood in the entrance and looked at the space, the carefully curated furniture, the art that had been selected by a consultant, the kitchen that was beautiful and impersonal, and he understood that he did not want to be here. Not in the way of a man who needs a different house. In the way of a man who has been living inside a set design and has only just noticed. He went to his study. He sat at his desk, the same desk where Marcus had sat across from him weeks ago, and told him the truth about Claire. And he opened his laptop, and he did something he had been avoiding. He read everything. Every piece of financial press coverage, every regulatory filing summary, every analyst note, every piece that had appeared since the Washington announcement. He read them not to manage them or respond to them, but simply to see them, to understand the full picture of what the past 14 months had built and what the past 72 hours had begun to dismantle. It took 3 hours. When he was done, it was nearly 3 in the morning, and the picture was exactly as bad as he had known it was, and it was clarifying to see it laid out plainly without the architecture of careful framing he had been maintaining around it. The company's actual position, the gap between that and its public presentation. The specific decisions, the specific moments, the specific choices he had made that had widened the gap instead of closing it. Howe was not a fraudulent person. He needed to hold on to that not as a defense, but as a navigational truth. He had not set out to deceive. He had set out to keep something alive that was struggling using the tools available to him and had crossed lines he should have refused gradually, incrementally, in the way that people cross lines when they are moving fast and afraid and too proud to stop and admit they need help. Pride. That was the operating system underneath all of it. Pride so deeply embedded that it had disguised itself as ambition, as leadership, as the justified confidence of a man who had built something real. But it was pride. The fear of being seen to fail, the inability to say out loud to the people around him, "I made mistakes. The company is in trouble. I need help." He could have said it 14 months ago. He could have said it to Marcus, who would have helped, to the board who would have worked with him, to Daniel, who would have found legal paths through the difficulty, to Claire, who, and this was the thought that sat in his chest like something physical to Claire, who had controlled a financial portfolio that could have restructured his company's debt in a single transaction without noticeably affecting the Valamont Foundation's position. She could have saved it. He had not asked her because he had not known she had that capacity. He had not known she had that capacity because he had never asked who she was. The circularity of it was almost elegant in the cruel way that certain truths are elegant. Every point on the circle led back to the same center. He had not been curious about his wife. Everything that followed the hidden debt, the company's collapse, the divorce, Washington, all of it traced back to that single unspectacular failure. The failure to be interested in the person beside him. He closed the laptop. He sat in the study for a while longer, not thinking particularly, just being in the quiet of it. Then he went to bed. He slept 7 hours, which was more than he had slept in months, and when he woke up, the house was full of morning light and the silence of a space that had never had enough life in it to miss. He knew what he needed to do next. He called Marcus at 8:15. "I want to do the restructuring right," he said without preamble. "Good morning to you too," Marcus said. "Sorry, good morning. I want to do the restructuring right. Full transparency. Every creditor, every partner, every vendor. I want them contacted personally before anything goes through legal channels. No one should read about their position in a press release." Marcus was quiet for a moment. "That's going to be a significant undertaking." "I know. I want to do it anyway." "Alex, you're no longer CEO." "I know that too. I'm asking whether you're still my partner." A longer pause. "I'm still your partner." "Then help me figure out how to do this with as much honesty as possible. Not for my reputation. For the people who are going to get hurt by this and who deserve to be told the truth directly by the person responsible." Marcus did not respond immediately. When he did, his voice had the quality of someone managing a significant amount of feeling very competently. "I'll be at your house in an hour," he said. He was there in 45 minutes. They worked for 6 hours at the kitchen table, not the study where the furniture said power, but the kitchen where the furniture just said two people trying to solve a problem. They built a list, every creditor, every major business partner, every vendor with significant exposure, every employee above a certain seniority who would need to understand the situation before it reached them through the press. 214 contacts. "We're going to need a team," Marcus said, looking at the list. "We'll build one," Alexander said. "This is going to cost you personally. The settlements, the direct communications. Some of these creditors are going to come after you individually when they understand the liability structure." "I know. And you're prepared for that." "I spent 14 months not being prepared for the consequences of my decisions," Alexander said. "It's time to be prepared." Marcus looked at him across the kitchen table with the look of a man who has known someone for 20 years and is seeing something in them that is familiar and also new. "All right," he said, "let's build the team." What happened over the next 3 weeks was the most difficult, sustained work Alexander had done in his life, and he had done genuinely difficult things. He called people who were angry. He sat in meetings where people were angrier. He listened to things he deserved to hear and did not defend himself because defense was not what those conversations required. What they required was the particular courage of staying present while someone tells you the truth about what your choices cost them. A vendor in Phoenix, a man named Gerald Oakes, who had been supplying materials to a Whitmore Global subsidiary for 6 years, said during a phone call, "My son works for you. He's been there 4 years. He thinks the world of the company. What am I supposed to tell him?" Alexander said, "Tell him that the company made mistakes at the leadership level and is trying to correct them with as much integrity as possible. Tell him that his work was real and his contribution was real, and none of this is about the quality of the people who worked there. And tell him I said that directly." Gerald Oakes was quiet for a moment. "That doesn't fix the outstanding invoice." "No, it doesn't. Here is what we're proposing on the invoice." He went through the numbers, the payment structure, the timeline, transparent, specific, realistic. Another silence. "You're different than I expected," Gerald said finally. "I'm trying to be," Alexander said. "I had that conversation in different forms 214 times over 3 weeks. He did not find it easy. It did not become easier with repetition. But it became gradually something he understood was necessary, not just for the creditors and the partners and the vendors, but for him. Each conversation was a small act of accountability that he could not do by proxy or delegate or manage through communications teams. He had to be the one to say, "I made these decisions." Here is what they cost. Here is what I am prepared to do about it. By the end of the third week, something unexpected was happening. Several of the creditors, not all and not the largest, but several had responded to the direct, unhurried honesty of the outreach with a flexibility that Daniel Forsythe had not predicted. Gerald Oakes came back with a counterproposal on his invoice that reflected a willingness to negotiate that he had not shown in the initial call. A real estate partner in Chicago, a woman named Sylvia Park, who had every legal reason to pursue maximum damages, called Marcus and said, "I don't know what's happening over there, but whoever is running this process, tell them it's working. We're willing to talk." Marcus reported this to Alexander at the end of week 3. They were back at the kitchen table. Marcus had the look of a man who has been surprised by something he should have seen coming. "People respond to honesty," Alexander said. "In theory," Marcus said. "In practice, I've spent 20 years in business watching people respond to leverage and carefully managed perception. Maybe that's what we got wrong." Marcus considered this for a long moment. "Maybe," he said. "Or maybe," he paused. "Maybe honesty only works when it's real, when people can tell you're not doing it for the optics. How do you tell the difference?" "I think you have to have nothing left to protect," Marcus said quietly. "Once you've already lost the thing you were trying to protect, the honesty becomes free. It doesn't cost you anything extra, and people can feel that." Alexander sat with that for a while. "Claire said something like that," he said. Marcus looked at him. It was the first time Alexander had brought her into a business conversation since the divorce, and Marcus handled it with the careful steadiness he brought to everything. "What did she say?" "She said—" Alexander paused, remembering the text message. "She said that the first decision I'd made in a long time that was actually about who I am, rather than what I was trying to protect, was recommending my own resignation." He looked at the table. "I think she was saying the same thing you just said. That real honesty only shows up when you stop protecting yourself." "She's been saying things like that for years," Marcus said, and then stopped himself. "I know," Alexander said. "I just wasn't listening." The weeks had a rhythm now difficult and clarifying in turns, with the particular quality of work that matters. Alexander had moved out of the Bel Air house quietly and without announcement into a rental apartment in Silver Lake that was small enough to feel honest. He had a kitchen table and a desk and a bed and his notebook, and that was sufficient. He had begun tentatively to think about what came next, not in terms of rebuilding a company. That chapter was finished, and he knew it, and he was surprisingly at peace with knowing it. In terms of what he actually wanted to do, what he was actually good at, stripped of the architecture of status that had surrounded his skills for so long that he had confused the architecture for the thing itself. He was good at identifying problems before other people saw them. He was good at persuading people toward positions they were not initially inclined to take. He was good at building systems. He was good at the particular combination of patience and urgency that complex long-cycle work requires. These skills did not require a company the size of Whitmore Global to be useful. He wrote about this in the notebook, and then he called Marcus, and they talked about it for 2 hours in a conversation that felt more like the conversations they had had 20 years ago when they were young and hungry and building something from nothing, except that now the hunger was for something different, something that had less to do with the external measurements of success and more to do with the actual substance of what was being created. "Infrastructure consulting," Marcus said. "What small practice? We advise on complex infrastructure projects, private clients, government clients. Use what we know without the liability of running a public company." He paused. "There's actual demand for it. The Meridian Group, the people who got the Valamont contract, they don't have the depth of operational knowledge we have. They got the contract on integrity. We could help them execute it." "You want to work with the company that won the contract Claire gave them." "I want to do work that's useful," Marcus said. "And I think you do too. And I think the fact that it connects back to her to that moment might be the universe being less subtle than usual." Alexander was quiet for a long moment. "Let me think about it." "Take your time. We're not in a hurry for the first time in 20 years. It's kind of remarkable." He thought about it for 2 days. On the second day, something happened that he had not expected and that shifted everything slightly on its axis. His phone rang at 2 in the afternoon, a number he didn't recognize. Washington area code. He answered. "Mr. Whitmore," a woman's voice, composed, professional, with the particular efficiency of someone who manages significant logistics. "This is Sandra Chen. I'm the executive coordinator for the Bennett Foundation. Ms. Valamont asked me to reach out to schedule a call. He sat down. A call, he repeated. Yes. She said, and I'm quoting directly, she said, to tell you that she's not ready to have the conversation in person yet, but she thinks it's time to have it by phone, and she'd like to know if you're available Thursday afternoon. Thursday. 4 days. Yes, he said. I'm available. 2 o'clock Pacific. 2 o'clock is fine. Thank you, Mr. Whitmore. She'll call you directly. The line went quiet. He sat with his phone and the particular feeling of a man who has been told something is coming and now has to exist inside the waiting for it. He did not know what she wanted to say. He did not know what he would say. He knew only that she had initiated it, which meant she had made a decision, and Claire's decisions were never careless. He told Marcus the next morning. Marcus said, "Don't prepare a speech." I wasn't planning to. You were. I know how you prepare for conversations. You script them. You anticipate and counter-anticipate. Don't. He paused. Just be the person from the coffee shop in Barstow. Be the person who was honest with 214 creditors. Don't perform for her. She'll see it immediately and she'll close the door. I know she will, Alexander said. Then you know what to do. Thursday at 2 o'clock. Alexander sat in his Silver Lake apartment at his kitchen table with his phone in front of him. He had not scripted anything. He had not made notes. He had sat for the 20 minutes before the call simply being quiet, which was something he had become better at over the past weeks, the capacity to be in a moment without filling it. His phone rang at 2 o'clock exactly. He picked up. Alexander. Her voice. The same voice. He had not spoken to her directly since Washington, since he had stood up in the third row and said her name across 300 people, and hearing it now in the quiet of his apartment was a different kind of impact, smaller and more significant simultaneously. Claire, he said. A brief silence, the kind between two people who have shared years of the particular intimacy of marriage and are now navigating what that history means in the present tense. I heard about the creditor outreach, she said. He had not expected that to be the first thing. Word travels. I have a foundation focused on economic recovery. Word travels to me specifically. A pause. Gerald Oakes sent me a letter. Gerald Oakes. The vendor in Phoenix. His son worked for your subsidiary. Gerald wrote to the Bennett Foundation because he'd heard about our work and thought we might be able to help his son navigate the job transition. She paused. He also wrote about his conversation with you. He said you were different than he expected. I told him the same thing I told everyone, Alexander said. I know. That's why he wrote about it. Another pause. It's what people do when something surprises them. They write it down because they want to confirm it was real. Alexander looked at his kitchen table, at the notebook that had become his constant companion. I understand that impulse, he said. I know you do. A pause. I've been reading about the restructuring. It's being handled with considerably more integrity than most people expected. I had a good model, he said. Watching someone do something with integrity in a very public setting tends to recalibrate your sense of what's possible. A brief silence on her end. He could not tell what it contained. Alexander, she said, I need to ask you something directly. All right. What do you want? Not from me. I'm not asking that. In general. What do you actually want now? Not what you thought you wanted before. Now. He had been sitting with this question in the notebook for weeks. He had written versions of the answer and crossed them out and written again. He was not going to give her the polished version. I want to do work that's real, he said. Not impressive. Real. Work where the thing I'm contributing is actually useful to someone, and where the external measurement of it, the reputation, the prestige is an afterthought rather than the point. He paused. I want to be curious about people. I want to actually know the people I care about, instead of collecting their presence. Another pause, shorter. I'm still figuring out the specifics. A silence on her end, longer than the others. That's a good answer, she said. It sounds like you. Which version of me? The early one, she paused. The one in the coffee shop. He felt that in his chest. That person got lost, he said. People do, she said. Success is very effective at convincing people that the version of themselves that achieved it is the real one. It's not. It's just the one that got good at a particular game. A pause. The real one is the one who doesn't need the game to feel like a person. How do you know so much about this? He asked, not rhetorically, genuinely. Because I watched someone build an empire and disappear inside it, she said quietly. For 5 years I watched it happen from close enough to touch, And before that, before you, I watched it happen to my family. The weight of a name so large that the person underneath it gets flattened." She paused. "That's why I left. That's why the bookstore. I needed to find out whether I was a person or just a symbol. I needed to know whether anyone would be interested in me without the name." "I was," he said. "I know you were," she said, "in the beginning." The honesty of that, the acknowledgement that it had been real and then had changed, sat between them without drama. He did not try to qualify it or expand it. It was what it was. "Claire," he said, "I'm sorry. I want to say it directly, not in a text message, not in a context where it could be mistaken for strategy. I was married to you for 5 years and I did not see you. I don't mean I didn't love you. I did in the capacity I had available, which was not enough. But I did not see you, and that is the thing I am most sorry for." A long silence. "I know," she said finally. Her voice was even, but there was something in it, not warmth exactly, not forgiveness, but something in the direction of both. Something that acknowledged the weight of what he'd said without either accepting or dismissing it. "I'm not asking for anything from that," he said. "I'm not asking for I understand that this whatever this is a conversation between two people who used to share a life and are now figuring out who they are separately. I'm not asking it to be more than that." "All right," she said. "All right. All right. That's what it is." She paused. "I do have one thing I want to say to you." "Tell me." "The Bennett Foundation," she said. "The economic recovery work we're doing, we have a gap in our advisory capacity. We need people who understand the operational side of corporate restructuring. How companies fail, what the employees go through. How to build pathways for people whose careers were derailed by something outside their control." A pause. "I'm not offering you this because of what we were to each other. I'm offering it because you have spent the past 3 weeks building exactly the kind of expertise and relationships that this work requires, and because Gerald Oakes wrote me a letter." He sat very still. "You want me to advise the Bennett Foundation. I want you to consider it. That's all. There's no obligation attached. It's not a gesture. It's a practical question about whether someone with your specific experience and your current state of mind would be useful to the work." "My current state of mind," he repeated. "The honest one," she said. "The one that's been calling creditors and sitting in diners in Barstow and writing in a notebook at kitchen tables." A pause. "Yes, that one. The foundation needs that person." He was quiet for a moment. "How do you know about the diner?" "Marcus," she said, and he could hear the ghost of something in her voice, not quite a smile, but the shape of one. "Marcus. Of course, Marcus." "I'll think about it," he said. "That's all I'm asking." Another silence. This one was different from the earlier ones. It had the quality of something that has been said and received and is settling into its proper shape. "Claire," he said. "Yes." "Thank you for calling." A pause. "Thank you for answering," she said. They hung up. He sat at the kitchen table for a long time. Outside his Silver Lake apartment, the afternoon was moving through its ordinary paces. Traffic voices, a dog barking somewhere down the block, the particular texture of a Los Angeles afternoon that has no interest in the significance of any particular moment happening inside any particular apartment. He opened his notebook. He wrote, "She called. We talked. I told the truth and she heard it. This is what it feels like to have an actual conversation with someone you actually know." He looked at it, added, "I should have been doing this for years." He put the pen down. "I thought about the Bennett Foundation, about the work it was doing, the women and men who had built lives around someone else's version of success and needed a door back to themselves." He thought about Gerald Oakes' son. He thought about the 214 conversations of the past 3 weeks, each one a small act of being present with someone who deserved his full attention. He thought about Marcus saying the universe was being less subtle than usual. "I thought about Claire in the coffee shop 20 years ago saying, 'What does a Nabokov person look like?' and laughing when he couldn't answer." He picked up his phone and called Marcus. "I'm going to do it," he said when Marcus answered. "The consulting practice." "That too, but also Claire called. The foundation needs an advisor for corporate restructuring work. I'm going to say yes." A pause. Then Marcus said, "I need to tell you something." "What?" "I called her 2 weeks ago. I told her about Barstow." "I know, she told me." "Are you angry?" Alexander considered. "No," he said. "You were doing what you've always done, trying to build something real out of whatever materials are available." He paused. "Thank you." Marcus was quiet for a moment. "She's a remarkable person," he said. "I know," Alexander said. "I'm just starting to understand exactly how remarkable." Better late than never. "Is it?" Alexander asked, not bitterly, genuinely. "I don't know," Marcus said honestly, "but it's better than not at all." They talked for another hour about the consulting practice, the structure of it, the first clients, the operational shape of something built on the actual substance of experience rather than the performance of prestige. By the time they hung up, the outline was clear enough to start. Alexander put the phone down. He looked at the notebook, at the 12 pages from the Washington coffee shop, at the entries from the 3 weeks of creditor conversations, at the line he had written this afternoon, "I should have been doing this for years." He turned to a clean page. At the top he wrote, "What I know now." Then he began to write. Not a plan, not a strategy, just the things he had learned about pride, about attention, about the specific blindness of success, about the distance between building something impressive and building something real. He wrote for an hour. When he stopped, the afternoon had shifted toward evening, and the Silver Lake apartment had the particular quiet of a space that is small enough to be honest, and Alexander Whitmore sat in it and felt not happy, because happy was not the right word for where he was in the arc of what this had cost, but present, genuinely, completely present, in his own life, in his own kitchen, with his own thoughts. It was not a small thing. For a man who had spent years performing himself in every room he entered, being genuinely present in a small apartment with no audience and no agenda was in fact an enormous thing. Outside Los Angeles was doing what it always did, moving and indifferent and magnificent in its complete disregard for any particular person's reckoning. Inside, a man who had once built an empire and then watched it fall was building something different. Something that had no name yet, and no external measurement, and no profile in any business magazine. Something that felt for the first time in a very long time like his actual life. The Bennett Foundation's Los Angeles office was not what Alexander had expected. He had expected something that looked like power, glass and steel, and the particular aesthetic of serious money presenting itself seriously. He had expected the visual language of an institution that understood its own importance. What he found was a converted 3-story building in Culver City, warm and deliberately unhurried, with staff who moved through the hallways with the focused energy of people who believed in what they were doing rather than people who were performing belief. There were plants that needed watering, and a coffee station that was clearly communal, and a front desk staffed by a young woman named Priya who said, "You must be Mr. Whitmore. Claire said you to be punctual," with the easy confidence of someone who worked for a person worth being easy and confident around. It had been 6 weeks since the phone call. 6 weeks in which Alexander had said yes to the foundation advisory role, had formalized the consulting practice with Marcus, had continued. The creditor conversations had moved from the Silver Lake apartment into something slightly larger, but not significantly different in spirit, and had written 40 more pages in the notebook. 6 weeks in which he and Claire had exchanged 11 messages, careful, specific, the kind of messages between people who are rebuilding trust in the only way trust can actually be rebuilt, which is slowly and through demonstrated consistency rather than declared intention. He had not seen her in person since Washington. He was going to see her today. He understood, walking through the foundation's entrance, that he was nervous in a way he had not been nervous in years. Not the performance anxiety of a man about to enter a room where he needed to win something rawer than that. The nervousness of a person about to stand in front of someone they failed significantly and be seen by them without the protection of distance or the mediation of text messages. Priya walked him to the 3rd floor. The conference room had a long table and 8 chairs and a window that let in afternoon light, and Claire was already there, standing at the far end with Charles Harrington and a woman Alexander didn't recognize. She was looking at a document when he entered. She looked up. Their eyes met across the length of the table. And for a moment, just one something passed between them that had no name in the language of business or strategy or even forgiveness. Something older than any of those things. The particular recognition of 2 people who have shared years of the private texture of a life together and carry that knowledge permanently, regardless of what has happened since. Then she said, "Alexander, thank you for coming," in the same professional tone she would have used with any advisor, and the moment resolved itself into the practical present. "Thank you for the invitation," he said. She introduced him to the woman he didn't recognize, Dr. Amara Osei, the Foundation's Director of Economic Programs, a Ghanaian-American economist in her mid-40s, with the precise, warm intelligence of someone who had spent 20 years turning research into action. Dr. Osei shook his hand and looked at him with frank assessment that was not unfriendly but was not deferential either. "I've read about the creditor outreach," she said. "The methodology was interesting." "It wasn't really a methodology," Alexander said. "It was just telling the truth directly to the people who needed to hear it." "That's what made it interesting," she said. Charles Harrington across the table said nothing. He simply looked at Alexander with the measured attention of a man who had been protecting Claire Valamont's interests for decades and was not yet prepared to stop. Alexander looked at him directly. "Mr. Harrington, I know what I owe her. I'm not here to undo that or to pretend otherwise. I'm here because she invited me and because I think I can be useful." Charles held his gaze for a long moment. Then he said, "She told me the same thing. She also told me that if you were different than she believed you to be, she trusted herself to recognize it quickly." A pause. "She has very good judgment." "She always did," Alexander said. "I just wasn't paying attention." Something shifted in Charles's expression. Not warmth exactly, he was too careful for warmth at this stage, but a fractional relaxation of the particular vigilance of a man who has been on guard for something and has received a preliminary indication that the thing may not arrive. Claire had been watching this exchange from the far end of the table. She said nothing, but Alexander could see, because he was finally paying the kind of attention he should have been paying years ago, that she was listening to every word and processing it with the particular focus she applied to everything that actually mattered. "All right," she said, "let's get to work." The work was real. That was the first thing Alexander understood within 20 minutes of the meeting beginning. The Bennett Foundation was not a symbolic enterprise or a wealthy woman's philanthropic hobby. It was an operational organization with genuine complexity, economic intervention programs, legal partnerships, employer networks, financial literacy curricula, re-entry pathways for people whose careers had been disrupted by circumstances ranging from corporate collapse to domestic situations to illness. Dr. Osei ran programs in 11 states with the precision of someone who understood that the difference between a program that helped people and one that performed helpfulness was in the operational details, and she was not going to let any advisor coast on good intentions. She put a case file in front of Alexander. "Tell me what you see." He read it. A manufacturing company in Ohio, mid-sized, had gone through a rapid contraction. 83 employees laid off over 6 weeks, most of them over 50, most of them with skill sets tied to processes that no longer existed in their region. The foundation had been engaged to develop re-entry pathways. He read carefully. He asked 2 questions. Then he said, "The problem isn't skills retraining. The problem is that the employers in the region who are hiring don't know how to evaluate experience from a different sector. The workers have a transferable capacity. They just don't know how to translate it, and the employers don't know how to look for it. You need an intermediary translation layer. Someone who can sit with an employer and say, this person who ran a manufacturing line for 20 years can run your logistics operation here is exactly how and why." Dr. Osei looked at him. "We've been trying to solve this for 8 months. It's a communication problem dressed as a skills problem," he said. "They're not the same thing." "No," she said. "They're not." She made a note. "Go on." I went on. For 2 hours, he went on through 4 case files, each one a different version of the same fundamental challenge that the Foundation's economic programs were navigating, and each one benefiting from the specific angle of vision that a man who had run a large corporation and then watched it collapse from the inside was uniquely positioned to provide. He could see what the employers were thinking because he had been an employer. He could see what the displaced workers were experiencing because he had spent 3 weeks on the phone with them. He was standing for the first time at an intersection where both sides of a complex problem were visible to him simultaneously. Claire sat at the end of the table for the first hour, then excused herself for a separate meeting, then returned for the last 30 minutes. She did not comment on his contributions. She listened. That was her way. He understood this now in a way he hadn't understood it during 5 years of marriage. She gathered information before she spoke. She did not perform engagement. She simply engaged. When the meeting concluded and Dr. Osei and Charles had left the room, Alexander and Claire were alone for the first time since Washington, since the third row, since he had stood up and said her name across 300 people and she had answered him with the truth. She was gathering papers from the table. He stood near the window, not filling the silence, which was something he had been practicing. "Amara likes you," Claire said without looking up from the papers. "I don't think that's accurate yet. I think she's reserving judgment. For Amara, that is liking you." She stacked the papers, set them aside, looked at him. "You were good in there." "I was useful," he said. "That's different from good." She looked at him for a moment. "You're doing the thing where you correct your own instincts." "Is that annoying?" "No," she said. "It's new." A pause. "It's new for you." He nodded. "It's been an interesting few months for self-correction." She almost smiled. Not quite. The shape of it, though, that specific movement at the corner of her mouth that he had not seen in so long, that its return was a physical thing, landing somewhere in the center of his chest. "I want to ask you something," he said. "All right." "Not about the foundation, not about work." He paused. "Do you ever think about what would have happened if I had been different earlier, if I had actually paid attention?" She was quiet for a moment. The quality of her quiet was different from most people's. It had weight and intention, the quiet of someone genuinely considering a question rather than preparing a response. "Sometimes," she said, "less than you might think." She looked at him steadily. "Because I'm not sure a different version of you earlier would have arrived here. And here," she gestured slightly, not at the room but at something larger. "Here is actually good. The work is good. The foundation is doing things that matter." A pause. "And you are more honest at 41 after everything collapsed than you were at 36 when everything was working. That's not nothing." "It cost a lot to get to honest," he said. "Most real things do," she said. He thought about what Marcus had said in the car outside the consulting office the previous week, that maybe the universe had been less subtle than usual about the sequence of events. He thought about Eleanor Valamont, who he had never met and never would meet as a son-in-law, saying men like that always find the door eventually. He thought about a diner in Barstow and a notebook and 40 pages of things he should have understood years earlier. "I should go," he said. "You have another meeting." "I do," she said. He moved toward the door. Then he stopped. "Claire," he turned back. "What you built here, the foundation, what Dr. Osei is doing with those programs, what Charles has been holding together all these years while you were in the bookstore." He paused. "I just want you to know that I see it, all of it. Not because it's impressive, though it is. Because it's real. Because you built something that actually matters, and you built it without needing anyone to notice, and I think that is—" He stopped. "I think that is the most remarkable thing I've ever been in the presence of." She looked at him. Her expression was not the expression of a woman being complimented. It was the expression of a woman being seen. There was a difference, and she knew it, and the fact that he knew the difference now was visible in how he said it. "Thank you," she said, quietly, meaning it. He left. In the elevator down, he stood with the particular feeling of a man who has said an honest thing and left it where it landed without trying to harvest anything from it. It was uncomfortable and clean simultaneously, like cold water. He was getting better at tolerating that combination. What happened over the following 4 months moved with the momentum of things that have been set in their proper direction and no longer require forcing. The consulting practice formalized. Marcus brought in the first 3 clients through relationships he had maintained with care through the collapse of Whitmore Global, and Alexander brought the specific expertise of someone who had seen a large company fail from the inside and understood at the operational level what that failure looked like before it became visible. They were good together in this new configuration, Marcus, with his relational intelligence and his 20 years of partnership networks. Alexander, with his recalibrated instincts and the hard-won knowledge of what happens when a business chooses performance over reality. Their first significant client was by a logic that no longer surprised Alexander, connected to the Valamont infrastructure contract. A mid-sized subcontractor on the Meridian Group project needed help restructuring its operations to meet the contract requirements. Marcus brought the introduction. Alexander did the first assessment. And on the second day of the engagement, the subcontractor's CEO, a practical, no-nonsense woman named Janet Reyes, looked at him across her conference table and said, "You used to run Whitmore Global." "Yes," he said. "And now you're here." "Yes." She studied him. "Why?" "Because this is useful," he said. And useful turned out to matter more to me than impressive. Janet Reyes looked at him for a long moment. Then she said, "All right, let's get to work," in exactly the tone that Dr. Osei had used in the foundation meeting, and Alexander understood that this was the sound of people who did real things, a certain directness, a certain impatience with anything that wasn't actually about the work. He found he was comfortable in that sound now, more comfortable than he had ever been in the sound of the other kind of room. The foundation advisory work deepened. Dr. Osei brought him into more cases the Ohio Manufacturing Workers, a group of retail managers in Phoenix, whose company had shuttered without adequate severance navigation, a cohort of construction professionals in Atlanta, whose licensing had lapsed during a period of personal crisis, and who needed help understanding the recertification pathway. Each case was specific and human, and required not just operational knowledge, but the capacity to sit with people in the reality of what had happened to them without minimizing it or rushing past it. He got better at that, not because someone taught him, because he practiced it deliberately in every conversation, the way you practice any skill that matters with attention and repetition, and the willingness to be bad at it at first. Gerald Oakes's son, whose name was David, came through the Foundation's re-entry program in Ohio. Alexander did not mention this to Claire. He found out through Dr. Osei's case updates, and he sat with the particular feeling of a thread connecting back to the beginning, a vendor in Phoenix, a letter, a phone call, a 2 o'clock on a Thursday, and he understood that this was what accountability actually looked like when it ran its full course. Not the grand gesture or the public statement, but the small thread that started with a phone call and ended with a 26-year-old man finding his next chapter. He put that in the notebook. 6 months after the Washington announcement, Eleanor Valamont called him. He had not expected this. He had not expected to ever speak with Eleanor Valamont. He knew who she was. Claire had told him in one of their foundation meetings that her grandmother was still the person whose judgment she trusted most in the world. But he had no framework for why the 91-year-old matriarch of the most powerful private family he had ever encountered would call him directly. She called on a Wednesday morning. He was at the consulting office, a small space he and Marcus had rented in downtown Los Angeles, deliberately modest because they had both agreed that the office should match the actual scale of what they were building rather than what they aspired to eventually become. "Mr. Whitmore," she said. Her voice was 91 and completely clear, like a signal that had lost nothing in transmission over decades. "Mrs. Valamont," he said. "Eleanor," she corrected. "I'm too old for titles with people my granddaughter has decided to trust." A pause. "She has decided to trust you, by the way. I thought you should know that. She hasn't said so directly. She rarely says things directly that she can demonstrate instead, but I know her well enough to read the demonstration." He was quiet for a moment, absorbing this. "How can I be sure you're telling me accurately and not strategically?" A brief silence. Then Eleanor Valamont laughed the same laugh Claire had described, dry and precise like a page turning in an old book. "Good," she said. "You're asking whether I have an agenda. You should. I usually do." Another pause. "In this case, I am telling you accurately, but I appreciate that you questioned it." "What can I do for you?" he asked. "Nothing," she said. "I called because I wanted to hear your voice. After everything Claire told me, I wanted to form my own impression." A pause. "I have one. And I think you are a man who needed to lose everything to understand what everything was for. That is not a rare condition. Many of the most valuable people I have known required that particular education." She paused. "The question is never whether the loss happens. The question is what the person does with what they learn." "And what do you think I'm doing with it?" "Something useful," she said, "which is the correct answer." Another pause. "Take care of her. She doesn't need—" "I know she doesn't need it," Eleanor said, with the patient firmness of a woman who has been correcting incomplete thoughts for 91 years. "I didn't say she needs it. I said take care of her. Those are different statements. She is entirely capable of taking care of herself. That has never been the question. The question is whether the people around her choose to show up with genuine attention or whether they require her to perform independence as a condition of their comfort." A pause. "Do you understand the difference?" I thought about it. "Yes," he said. "I do." "Good," Eleanor said. "Then we understand each other." She hung up. He sat with his phone in his hand for a full minute. Then he put it down and opened his notebook and wrote, "Eleanor Valamont called. She is 91 years old, and she understood something about attention in 45 seconds that I spent 5 years failing to practice. There is a lesson in that about what age actually earns you when you pay it the right kind of attention. He looked at it, added, "The difference between needing and choosing. She's right. Those are not the same." 7 months after Washington, Claire asked him to meet her in person, not at the foundation, not at a business meeting, at Second Chapter Books. She had kept it. He had assumed after everything that she would close it, that the bookstore was a chapter of the hidden identity, something that belonged to the Claire who was disappearing into a quiet Los Angeles life, and that the return of Claire Alexandra Bennett Valamont would make the small bookstore in Silver Lake irrelevant. He had been wrong about that, which did not surprise him anymore. He was wrong about her with such consistent specificity that he had stopped trying to predict and started trying to simply observe. He arrived at the bookstore at 4 in the afternoon on a Saturday. The front door was unlocked. The sign said closed, but the door opened when he tried it because she had left it for him. He walked in. The smell of old paper and the particular quiet of a room built for attention. The shelves he had walked past 100 times without looking at. He looked at them now. She was in the back at the small wooden table that she used as a desk with 2 cups of tea and a book open in front of her that she was not reading. She looked up when he came through. "Sit down," she said. He sat across from her. He accepted the tea. He looked at the book Nabokov. He almost said something about it. He let it be. "I've been thinking," she said, about what this is." She gestured between them, not dramatically, just the small, precise gesture of a woman naming something she has been examining carefully. "Between us, what it is now and what it could be." He waited. He had learned to wait. "I'm not ready to call it what it was," she said. "I don't know if I'll ever be ready for that. What we were is finished, and I think it needs to stay finished, because going back to something is not the same as building something new, and I don't want to go back." She looked at him steadily. "But I think we're building something new. I think we have been without naming it, and I want to know if you see it the same way." He took a breath. He thought about the notebook, about 40 pages and then 40 more, about the diner in Barstow and the creditor calls, and Eleanor saying, "Take care of her, and do you understand the difference?" "I see it," he said. "I see it, and I don't want to rush it or claim it before it's ready to be claimed. I just want to keep showing up honestly, the way I didn't before." A pause. "And I want you to know that whether it becomes more than what it is right now, or it stays exactly what it is right now, I'm not going anywhere. I'm not here because of what I hope you'll give me. I'm here because of who you are, and that is the first time in my adult life I've been able to say that about anyone." She looked at him for a long moment. "I know," she said. "I can tell the difference now." "Between what?" "Between someone being present because they want something and someone being present because they've chosen to be." She picked up her tea. "You've chosen." "Every day," he said. She nodded. Not the nod of a woman being convinced. The nod of a woman who has already verified something through careful observation and is confirming what she found. "Then we're in the same place," she said. Outside, the Silver Lake afternoon was doing what Silver Lake afternoons do, unhurried and warm and specific in the way that neighborhoods have a specificity that larger places lose. Inside the bookstore, 2 people sat across a small wooden table with cups of tea and the accumulated weight of everything that had happened between them and the particular lightness that comes when 2 people decide deliberately and with full information to be honest with each other. It was not a reconciliation. It was something more careful than that. Something built on the actual materials of who they both were now, rather than who they had been or who they had failed to be. That was, they both understood, the only foundation worth building on. 3 months later, the Bennett Foundation announced the expansion of its Corporate Accountability Advisory Program, a new initiative designed to help companies in financial distress navigate restructuring with transparency, protecting employees and vendors through the process rather than at the end of it. The program was designed in collaboration with an external advisory practice. The press release did not name the practice. It did not need to. The people who needed to know knew. Gerald Oakes' son David, now 8 months into a new position at a logistics company in Cincinnati that had come through the Foundation's employer network, sent a handwritten note to the Bennett Foundation's Los Angeles office. It was addressed to Claire. It said, "I don't know exactly what happened or how this all connected, but I know that someone made a phone call to my father when they didn't have to, and someone built a program that found me when I couldn't find myself, and I wanted you to know that it mattered. It mattered more than I can say." Claire read it at her desk. She set it down. She sat with it for a moment in the quiet of the room. Then she picked up her phone and sent a message to Alexander. One line. David Oakes found his next chapter. His response came within 2 minutes. "Good. That's the whole point." She put the phone down. She looked at the room around her, the foundation she had built from the life she had chosen, the work that was real, the network of people who showed up every day because they believed in what they were doing. She thought about Eleanor, who had called her the previous week at 91 to say with her characteristic precision, "I think you've handled all of this remarkably well, and I want you to know I was never worried." "You were worried," Claire had said. "Yes," Eleanor had said, "but I was also confident. Those two things can coexist." She thought about Charles Harrington, who had been at her side for 8 years of this complicated navigation, and who had said at the end of their last meeting, "Your grandmother was right about you. She said you would know when it was time. I think you knew." She thought about the bookstore, about Nabokov and the coffee shop, and the man who had said, "What does a Nabokov person look like?" and laughed when she questioned him, about the version of that man she had fallen in love with, and the version that had handed her a folder at an anniversary dinner, and the version that now sat across small tables with notebooks and chose every day to be present. She thought about all the women and men who had come through the Foundation's programs, who had needed a door back to themselves after being told in one way or another that their value was conditional on someone else's approval. She had built the door. It had taken everything: the hidden years, the public humiliation, the careful dismantling of one man's false empire, the slow and non-linear work of building something real from the aftermath, but she had built it, and it was open. The most dangerous mistake anyone could make was underestimating the person standing quietly beside them. Alexander Whitmore had made that mistake publicly, and at cost, and had paid for it in the only currency that actually matters: the slow, daily, unglamorous work of becoming someone worth standing beside. Claire Alexandra Bennett Valamont had never needed his validation to know her worth. She had known it before he arrived, and she had carried it through every year of being invisible inside her own marriage. And she had walked out of a ballroom with signed papers and a steady hand and built something that outlasted everything he had tried to build. That was not a story about revenge. It was a story about what happens when a person who has always known exactly who they are finally stops waiting for the world to catch up. The world caught up, and the woman who everyone had underestimated simply kept working.